I suspected my own son of betrayal, so I faked a vacation and hid a camera inside my own office. The janitor whispered to me to watch the feed at exactly 6 in the evening and I would understand everything. When the clock struck 6, I looked at the screen and nearly stopped breathing. The ultimate betrayal I witnessed on that monitor broke my heart into pieces, but it also ignited a fire inside me. I knew exactly what I had to do next, and my revenge was going to be completely ruthless. My name is Harrison Hayes. I am 69 years old and the founder of a shipping empire I built from the dirt up. Before I tell you how my own flesh and blood tried to throw me away like garbage, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that nobody has the right to steal what you worked your whole life to build. Growing up as a black man in a neighborhood where opportunities were non-existent, I learned early that nobody was going to hand me anything. I built Hayes Logistics with my bare hands, driving trucks through snowstorms, sleeping in loading docks, and fighting for every single contract. I gave my son Kendrick everything I never had. But I never imagined the boy I raised would one day sit back and let his wife plot my destruction. The interior of my vehicle was freezing, but I did not turn on the engine. I sat in the darkest corner of the company parking garage staring at the glowing screen of my tablet. The concrete walls felt like a cold tomb around me. It was 5:58 in the evening. I tapped the screen and accessed the hidden camera I had installed over the weekend. The camera was perfectly disguised inside the smoke detector of my old corner office, the very office I had handed over to my son Kendrick just 6 months ago after a mild heart attack forced me to slow down. I adjusted the volume and leaned closer to the glass. The high-definition feed loaded, showing the familiar mahogany desk and the heavy leather chairs I had purchased after signing my first $1 million contract. Now my son sat in my chair, but he was not alone. His wife Megan was pacing the floor behind him. I watched the live video stream with a heavy physical weight pressing against my ribs. The clock on my dashboard flipped to exactly 6 o'clock. I never would have resorted to planting cameras if it had not been for Hector. Hector is the head janitor and the only man in that building who remembers what we went through in the early days. Hector and I used to unload crates in the freezing rain back in the 80s when nobody else would hire us. This morning, as I was pretending to pack my golf clubs into the trunk for a fake trip to Florida, Hector walked by with his trash cart. He did not look at me directly, but he stopped just close enough to whisper his warning. "Mr. Hayes, you need to look at what they are doing after hours," he said quietly. "Watch The Office at 6 p.m. because they think you are out of the picture now." His words confirmed the terrible gnawing feeling I had in my gut for months. After my surgery, I let Kendrick take the wheel to give myself a break. Almost immediately, the company accounts started looking strange. Unexplained withdrawals and missing invoices were suddenly a regular occurrence. Kendrick blamed it on system upgrades, but I knew a rat when I smelled one. I just never wanted to believe the rat carried my last name. On the screen, Megan walked over to my private liquor cabinet. She did not even hesitate. She grabbed the $2,000 bottle of rare bourbon I had saved for my eventual retirement and poured 2 massive glasses. She handed one to my son Kendrick and clinked her glass against his. "To early retirements," she said with a chilling smirk on her face. Kendrick let out a weak laugh and took a sip. I watched my son, the boy I had taught to throw a baseball, sit there and allow his wife to mock my entire life of hard work. Megan has always looked at me with this quiet disdain. She came from money, but her family was drowning in debt, and she always viewed my wealth as something she was entitled to. Megan set her glass down and pulled a thick stack of legal documents from her designer briefcase. She slammed them onto the mahogany desk right in front of him. "You have the pen, right?" she asked him. Her voice was sharp and commanding, leaving no room for argument. Kendrick nodded, pulling my gold fountain pen from his pocket. The exact pen I gave him when he graduated college. But Megan did not let him sign. Instead, she snatched the pen right out of his hand. "Let me do the signatures," she said coldly. "Your hands are shaking too much. I will make his signature perfect because I have practiced it 100 times. I watched in absolute horror as my daughter-in-law leaned over the desk and began forging my name. She moved the pen with practiced precision, stamping my identity onto page after page. Kendrick just sat there staring at the floor. He did not try to stop her. He did not say a single word to defend the father who had given him the world. "You are an absolute coward, Kendrick," I whispered to myself in the dark vehicle. Megan finished the last page and blew on the ink to dry it. "The old man is completely clueless." She laughed, tossing the pen aside. He actually thinks he is going to play golf in Florida while we take care of his messy little business. Once this is filed, we will have full control of every single dime. I felt my hands gripping the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles popped loudly in the quiet car. The sheer disrespect was sickening. They were drinking my liquor, sitting in my chair, and stealing my company. I reached for the door handle, ready to march up to the top floor and throw them both through the glass window. I wanted to see the look of pure terror on Megan's face when I kicked the door down. I wanted to grab Kendrick by his expensive collar and demand to know why he would sell his soul to this woman. But something stopped me. The discipline of a man who survived decades of ruthless corporate battles forced me to take my hand off the door handle. In business, you never react until you know exactly what is on the table. If I burst in there now, they could destroy the paperwork and claim it was a misunderstanding. I grabbed the tablet and zoomed in on the camera feed. The camera was high resolution, allowing me to read the bold black text at the very top of the document Megan had just forged. It was not a business contract. It was not a real estate transfer. My eyes scanned the words and the air was instantly sucked out of my lungs. The title of the document read, "Involuntary Medical Commitment and Power of Attorney." My heart hammered violently against my chest. This was not just financial theft. This was a planned assassination of my freedom and my mind. Megan pulled out her cell phone and dialed a number on speakerphone. A man answered immediately. "Dr. Thorne here," the voice said. Megan smiled brightly. "Doctor, the paperwork is signed by Mr. Hayes himself, granting us emergency medical proxy." She lied smoothly. "His dementia has escalated rapidly, and he has become a huge danger to himself." He signed the consent forms during a brief moment of clarity. "Is the transport ready?" "Absolutely," the doctor replied without any hesitation. "The private ambulance will arrive at his home tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. sharp. We have a secure room prepared for him at the state psychiatric facility. He will be safely and heavily sedated upon arrival so he cannot cause any trouble." "Thank you," Dr. Megan said and ended the call. She turned to Kendrick and kissed his cheek. "Tomorrow your father disappears into a padded cell and we become the kings of the castle." My blood turned to absolute ice. They were not just stealing my money. They had bribed a corrupt doctor to have me locked inside a mental asylum for the rest of my life. If I was taken to that facility, they would drug me until I actually lost my mind. I would vanish and nobody would ever ask questions. And the ambulance was coming for me in exactly 13 hours. I was officially a hunted man in my own city. I carefully put the vehicle in drive and pulled out of the parking lot into the dark night. I was not going to Florida, and I was certainly not going to a hospital. I was going to war. The sun rose over the city like a cold gray eye, but I had not slept a single minute. I spent the entire night parked in an industrial alley watching the rearview mirror and calculating my next move. A man without money is a man without a shield, and I needed the heaviest shield money could buy. I needed a ruthless defense attorney. At exactly 8:50 in the morning, I pulled up to the towering glass doors of First National Central Bank. This was not a local branch. This was the main hub where I kept my personal fortress of liquid assets. I stepped out of the vehicle and straightened my coat, forcing my exhausted muscles to stand tall. I walked through the revolving doors with the heavy, measured steps of a man who owned the ground he walked on. The marble floor echoed under my boots. I bypassed the regular teller lines and walked directly toward the private wealth management wing. The receptionist smiled politely, but I did not stop to make small talk. I needed $50,000 in unmarked bills, and I needed it before the clock struck 9. Every second that passed brought Megan and her hired medical thugs closer to my front door. I pushed open the frosted glass door of the branch manager office without knocking. My heart was a steady drum against my ribs, but my face was a mask of absolute authority. I was Harrison Hayes, and this bank had grown fat off my deposits for decades. I sat down heavily in the leather chair across from the empty desk, waiting for the manager. My mind flashed back 40 years to the day I opened this exact account. Back then, I was a young black man with grease on his hands and a check that most white bankers assumed was fraudulent. I did not trust computers, and I certainly did not trust the banking system to protect me if things went south. So I established a draconian emergency protocol. It was a physical override code written in ink stored in the deepest vault of this building. No digital authorization, no app approvals. Just me presenting my physical identification and speaking a specific 6-word phrase to the highest-ranking officer in the building. That protocol was designed to bypass any corporate freeze or legal injunction, instantly allowing me to walk out with enough cash to disappear or fight back. It was my ultimate insurance policy, and today was the exact disaster I had anticipated 4 decades ago. I had never used it. Not during the recession, not during my divorce, not ever. But the moment to break the glass had finally arrived. The heavy oak door swung open, but it was not just the branch manager who walked in. Mr. Sterling, a man whose career I had personally helped build, entered the room looking visibly pale. He was flanked by 2 massive security guards in dark uniforms. They did not take their usual positions by the door. Instead, they stepped right behind my chair, crossing their arms. Mr. Sterling did not offer his hand to shake. He did not offer me coffee. He sat behind his desk and folded his hands tightly over a manila folder. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice trembling slightly. I leaned forward and looked him dead in the eye. "Cut the pleasantries," I said sharply. "I am executing Directive Protocol Alpha 9. I need $50,000 in cash right now." Sterling swallowed hard and shook his head, pushing the folder across the polished wood toward me. "I am so sorry, Harrison, but I cannot authorize that transaction," he said quietly. "I cannot authorize any transaction. Your accounts are completely frozen." I stared at him, my blood suddenly running hot. I reminded him that my emergency protocol overrides any standard banking freeze. But Sterling just shook his head again, refusing to make eye contact. "This is not a standard corporate freeze," he explained, his voice dropping to a whisper. "At 7 o'clock this morning, your son Kendrick Hayes and his legal team served us with a binding court order." I snatched the folder from the desk and flipped it open. The document staring back at me was terrifyingly official. It bore the heavy seal of the state Supreme Court and the signature of a judge I knew by name. The title at the top read, "Full Medical and Financial Power of Attorney." My eyes darted down the page, absorbing the poisonous words Megan had orchestrated. The document claimed I was suffering from advanced cognitive decline, severe paranoia, and violent tendencies. It stated I was legally incompetent to manage my own affairs, my business, or my finances. According to this piece of paper, my own son was now my legal guardian. The signature at the bottom was perfectly forged by my daughter-in-law just 12 hours ago. Sterling cleared his throat nervously. "Because of this document, you no longer have signatory authority over the corporate accounts, your personal retirement funds, or your safety deposit boxes. We are legally bound to deny you access to the premises. If I give you a single dollar, I would be committing a federal crime by aiding an incapacitated person. You have to leave this bank immediately, Mr. Hayes." I looked from the fake document to the 2 security guards standing behind me. The trap had been sprung with terrifying speed. They had not just stolen my money, they had stripped me of my very identity. The cold reality of the situation crashed over me like an ocean wave. I was no longer a respected businessman. In the eyes of the law, I was a helpless old man, a ward of the state, entirely dependent on the mercy of the very people trying to destroy me. I had officially lost my civil rights. I could not sign a check. I could not sell my own house. I could not even hire a lawyer to defend myself because any contract I signed would be instantly voided by this piece of paper. Megan had built an invisible prison around me overnight, and the bars were made of perfect legal jargon. I was entirely erased from the system I helped build. A lifetime of hard work, discipline, and sacrifice had been wiped out by one forged signature and a corrupt doctor. "Sir, we need you to vacate the premises right now," one of the security guards barked, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. I did not struggle. Causing a scene would only prove their fake medical diagnosis. I stood up slowly, brushing his hand away with a cold glare. "I will find my own way out," I said quietly. The guards flanked me closely, marching me across the marble lobby like a common criminal. Clients stopped to stare at the humiliating spectacle. As the glass doors slid open to the cold street, my cell phone vibrated violently in my coat pocket. I stepped onto the sidewalk and pulled it out. The caller ID displayed State Psychiatric Hospital. I answered the call without speaking. A sterile female voice spoke through the speaker. "Mr. Hayes, please remain at your current location outside the First National Central Bank. Our medical transport unit has tracked your cellular signal and is exactly 3 minutes away to escort you to our secure facility. Do not attempt to flee." I hung up the phone and looked down the street. In the distance, the flashing red lights of a private ambulance were already turning the corner, speeding directly toward me. The wail of the ambulance siren cut through the morning air like a knife. The private medical transport was a block away, its flashing red lights reflecting off the glass facades of the financial district. The security guard tightened his grip on my shoulder, clearly intending to hold me in place and hand me over to the orderlies. He made the fatal mistake of thinking I was just a frail old man. I did not survive the gritty streets of my youth by being passive. I pivoted sharply, driving my elbow hard into the soft tissue of the guard's stomach. He gasped loudly, his iron grip instantly breaking. Before the second guard could react, I shoved him backward into a group of startled businessmen in tailored suits. Chaos erupted on the sidewalk. Briefcases fell, hot coffee spilled, and angry shouts rang out. I did not look back. I pulled the collar of my heavy coat up and plunged directly into the thickest part of the pedestrian crowd crossing the busy intersection. I kept my head down, matching the hurried pace of the morning commuters. Behind me, I could hear the ambulance screech to a halt and the confused shouts of the bank guards, but I was already a ghost. I ducked into a subway station, swiped my transit card, and boarded a crowded train heading away from the downtown financial district. I stood shoulder to shoulder with strangers, feeling the steady rhythm of the tracks beneath my feet. I watched the fluorescent lights flicker as the train plunged into the dark tunnel. I had escaped the immediate trap, but my pockets were completely empty. To fight a war, you need capital, and I had exactly $0 to my name. The train carried me far from the polished marble of downtown, dropping me off in a neglected neighborhood where the buildings were covered in graffiti and the storefronts had heavy iron bars over the windows. I walked 3 blocks until I saw the flickering neon sign of a pawn shop. I stepped inside. The air smelled of old dust and desperate decisions. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the only asset Megan had not been able to freeze. It was a solid gold Rolex watch. My late wife Corinne had given it to me on our 30th wedding anniversary. It was the most precious thing I owned, holding the memory of her gentle smile and the beautiful life we built together. But Corinne was a fierce protector in life, and she would have told me to burn the entire city down before letting thieves take our family legacy. I placed the heavy gold timepiece on the scratched glass counter. The pawnbroker, a man with tired eyes, examined it through a jeweler's loupe. He knew it was worth $20,000, but he offered me $8,000. I did not argue. I did not negotiate. I just nodded my head. He counted out the dirty, wrinkled $100 bills and slid them across the counter. I pocketed the cash, feeling the ghost of Corinne giving me her silent blessing. With a thick wad of untraceable cash in my pocket, I went straight to the only attorney in the city vicious enough to handle this situation. Nathaniel Reed did not operate out of a fancy high-rise building. His office was above a bail bondsman shop, smelling faintly of stale cigar smoke and cheap coffee. Nathaniel was a shark. He did not care about morals, he only cared about winning, and he hated losing more than he loved money. I walked into his office, bypassed his complaining secretary, and dropped the stack of $100 bills directly onto his cluttered desk. I told him I needed his absolute loyalty, and I told him exactly what my son and daughter-in-law had done. Nathaniel counted the money silently, locked his office door, and opened his laptop. For the next hour, he hacked his way through the public court databases and the state medical registries, bypassing security walls with the ease of a master thief. The deeper he dug, the darker his expression became. He finally leaned back in his leather chair and rubbed his face. "Mr. Hayes," he said grimly, "your daughter-in-law is a terrifyingly smart woman. This is not a sloppy power grab. She has orchestrated a flawless legal execution." Nathaniel turned his laptop screen toward me. He showed me the involuntary commitment order and the power of attorney documents. "The doctor who signed off on your dementia diagnosis is a highly respected neurologist," Nathaniel explained. "Megan paid him off, but on paper his medical opinion is absolute gospel. Furthermore, the notary who stamped these documents has a spotless record. The signatures match perfectly. If we walk into a courtroom tomorrow and claim this is a forgery, the judge will look at your age, look at the doctor's signature, and immediately agree that you are paranoid and delusional. Fighting this through standard litigation will take years. You will be locked inside a psychiatric ward, heavily sedated long before we even get a preliminary hearing. The system is designed to protect the vulnerable, but Megan has weaponized it to trap you. If you show your face to any authority figure right now, the police will politely put you in handcuffs and escort you to the asylum for your own safety." I absorbed the crushing reality of his words. Megan had not just locked the doors, she had welded them shut. I was legally dead, but I refused to accept defeat. I told Nathaniel that there had to be a motive beyond just grabbing my seat at the head of the table. Kendrick was too lazy to run the company, and Megan was too greedy to just sit on the board. They wanted cash, and they wanted it fast. I ordered Nathaniel to stop looking at the medical files and start looking at the corporate money trail. Nathaniel cracked his knuckles and began running a shadow audit on Hayes Logistics, using a backdoor access portal he kept for corporate espionage. The keyboard clattered rapidly under his fingers. Within 20 minutes, he hit a massive financial anomaly. He whistled softly under his breath. "You were right, Harrison," he muttered, his eyes glued to the glowing screen. "They are not just taking over your company, they are bleeding it dry." Nathaniel explained that over the past 48 hours, massive liquid assets had been aggressively drained from the corporate operational accounts. We were talking about millions of dollars intended for payroll, fleet maintenance, and vendor contracts. If this hemorrhaging continued for another week, my company would have to declare bankruptcy. The money was being funneled through a complex series of shell companies, ultimately vanishing offshore. It was all being routed into an irrevocable private trust located in the Cayman Islands. I leaned over the desk, my eyes scanning the complex routing numbers on the screen. "Tell me who owns that Cayman trust," I demanded. If Kendrick was hoarding that money, I needed to know exactly where he was hiding it. Nathaniel ran the trust identification number through a global offshore database. The search took agonizing minutes, buffering against firewalls and encrypted international servers. Finally, a single name appeared in bold green letters on the screen. It was not Kendrick Hayes. My son was not the owner of the stolen millions. The name on the screen was Richard Thorne. The air in the room grew instantly heavy. Richard Thorne was Megan's father. He was a ruthless real estate tycoon who had recently filed for bankruptcy protection after a series of disastrous commercial investments. Suddenly, the entire puzzle locked together perfectly. Kendrick was nothing but a gullible pawn. Megan did not love him, and she certainly did not care about running my logistics company. She was systematically gutting my empire to save her father's sinking real estate business. My own son had sold me out for a woman who was actively stealing from him. The real enemy was not the cowardly boy I raised. The real enemy was a desperate billionaire pulling the strings from the shadows. And I knew exactly how to cut those strings. Knowing that Richard Thorne was the puppet master completely changed the battlefield. My son Kendrick and his wife Megan were just foot soldiers in a much larger, far more destructive corporate war. I needed concrete proof of their financial collusion to take to the federal authorities, and I knew exactly where that proof was kept. Years ago, before cloud storage became the standard for every business, I maintained a physical encrypted backup drive. It contained every unredacted financial record, offshore routing number, and original property deed related to Hayes Logistics. It was a digital vault of my entire empire, and it was hidden beneath a loose floorboard directly under the heavy oak bed in my master bedroom. I had to go back to the very place where they had laid their trap. I waited until exactly 2 a.m. before making my move. The wealthy suburban streets were dead quiet, illuminated only by the pale, cold glow of the streetlights. I parked my stolen vehicle 3 blocks away, hidden behind an overgrown hedge, and approached my own property on foot. The massive iron gates of my driveway were locked shut, and a brand new state-of-the-art digital keypad had been installed on the brick pillar. Megan had wasted no time turning my own home into a fortified prison designed to keep me out. I stood in the deep shadows of the ancient oak trees lining the perimeter, feeling a cold, burning fury rise in my chest. They had stolen my company and frozen my bank accounts, but they were absolute fools to think a locked gate could keep me out of the house I built with my own hands. Before I was a logistics chief executive officer, I was a young, disciplined Marine serving in the deepest jungles of Vietnam. The military taught me how to move without being seen, how to read an enemy perimeter, and how to find the critical blind spots in any defensive formation. Megan might have bought the most expensive home security system on the market, but she did not know the physical terrain of this property. I knew every blind spot because I had designed the landscaping myself decades ago. I moved silently along the eastern wall, slipping like a ghost through the dense rhododendron bushes that shielded the service entrance from the street view. I climbed the thick stone trellis attached to the side of the garage, testing each handhold and foothold carefully to ensure no loose rocks would fall and give away my position in the silent night. My 69-year-old muscles burned with the intense physical effort, but the pure adrenaline pumping through my veins masked the pain. I reached the flat roof of the garage and stayed incredibly low, crawling on my stomach across the freezing asphalt shingles. From this elevated vantage point, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the backyard and the glowing windows of the first floor. I peered cautiously over the edge of the roof and looked down into the living room through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The house was not empty. Megan had not just changed the locks to keep me out, she had brought in heavy reinforcements. Two massive men wearing white medical scrubs were sitting on my custom leather sofas. They did not look like standard hospital nurses. They possessed the thick, muscular necks and heavy shoulders of nightclub bouncers or private military contractors. One was mindlessly scrolling through a glowing smartphone while the other was watching a late-night sports broadcast with the television volume turned down extremely low. They were the extraction team waiting patiently for me to walk blindly through the front door so they could ambush me with heavy chemical sedatives and a straitjacket. I watched them for a long moment, memorizing their positions and measuring their reaction times. I could not fight two heavily armed younger orderlies in a direct physical confrontation. I needed to bypass them entirely and strike from above. I slid silently off of the garage roof and dropped onto the second-floor balcony, landing softly on the balls of my feet like a hunting cat. The master bedroom was right in front of me, but the heavy glass doors were securely locked from the inside. Breaking the glass would instantly alert the men sitting downstairs. Instead, I reached up and silently unscrewed the metal grating of the heavy-duty return air vent located just above the balcony awning. I had insisted on oversized industrial-grade ductwork when building the house to ensure maximum airflow during the hot summers. Now that architectural choice was my absolute only way in. I pulled myself upward into the dark, dusty shaft. The metal groaned slightly under my weight, forcing me to freeze and listen carefully. When no alarm sounded, I began crawling forward inch by inch. The air inside the vent was stifling and smelled strongly of old dust and dry wood. I navigated the sharp 90-degree turns using my elbows and knees to silently drag my body through the pitch-black darkness. I finally reached the vent positioned directly above the master bedroom. I carefully pushed the grill out, caught it before it could fall, and lowered myself silently to the carpeted floor. The room was exactly as I had left it, though Megan had carelessly tossed some of her expensive designer shopping bags onto my neatly made bed. I dropped to my knees, slid my fingers under the edge of the heavy oak bed frame, and counted exactly 3 floorboards to the left. I pressed down hard on the hidden mechanical latch. The wood popped up with a very soft click. I reached deep into the dark cavity and pulled out the heavy black external hard drive. It was freezing cold to the touch. This small piece of metal held the ultimate key to proving Richard Thorne was illegally siphoning my corporate assets. I slipped the drive securely into the inside pocket of my heavy winter coat and zipped it up tight. I had secured the weapon. Now I just needed to get out of the house alive. I moved quietly back toward the balcony doors, intending to exit the room exactly the way I had come in through the ceiling vent. I took a slow, calculated step backward to avoid a notoriously creaky floorboard I had known about for over 20 years. But Megan had been incredibly busy today fortifying her stolen castle. As I shifted my weight onto the plush carpet near the doorway, my heavy leather boot brushed against something rigid that had absolutely not been there yesterday. It was a tiny, low-profile infrared tripwire sensor installed directly into the wooden baseboard molding. I felt the faint, microscopic resistance of the invisible laser beam breaking against my ankle. I froze instantly, my heart dropping straight into my stomach. A tiny light on the baseboard blinked from a safe green to a solid, threatening red. I had tripped the silent digital alarm. Instantly, the entire house erupted into absolute chaos. A deafening, piercing siren blasted through the hidden wall speakers, vibrating the very floorboards beneath my boots. Flashing strobe lights cut through the darkness outside, illuminating the manicured lawn in harsh, blinding bursts of white light. A robotic, automated voice announced loudly that a perimeter breach had been detected and local law enforcement was being immediately notified. I heard the heavy, terrifying thud of combat boots sprinting up the main wooden staircase. The 2 massive orderlies were coming straight for me. I did not have the time to climb back into the ceiling vent. I unlatched the balcony doors, shoved them open violently, and vaulted over the railing without hesitating for a single second. I hit the soft dirt of the garden bed hard, rolling instinctively to absorb the brutal impact. I scrambled to my feet just as the orderlies burst onto the balcony above me, shouting angrily into their 2-way radios. The advanced facial recognition cameras mounted on the eaves locked onto my face, projecting my identity directly to the police dispatch network. I sprinted toward the dark service alley behind the property. Headlights suddenly blinded me. A massive sanitation truck was rolling slowly down the alley, completing its late-night garbage pickup route. I ran alongside the heavy machine, grabbed the cold metal ladder on the side of the compactor, and hauled myself up just as police sirens began wailing loudly in the distance. The heavy sanitation truck carried me several blocks away from the flashing police lights and the chaotic blare of the security alarms. I jumped off the side ladder when the driver slowed down for a red light, hitting the wet pavement hard and rolling into the shadows. I slipped through a maze of dark alleys until I found a cheap rundown motel located on the absolute edge of the city limits. I paid the tired night clerk with a crumpled $100 bill from the pawn shop, keeping my face completely hidden under the heavy collar of my winter coat. The room smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. The flickering neon sign outside buzzed loudly against the thin glass, casting a harsh red light across the stained carpet. I immediately locked the deadbolt, wedged a heavy wooden chair under the door handle, and sat down at the wobbly laminate desk. I had purchased a cheap burner laptop from a 24-hour electronics store along the way. My hands were covered in dark dirt and badly scraped from climbing the stone wall of my estate, but they did not shake at all as I pulled the cold black external hard drive from my deep coat pocket. This small rectangular piece of metal was the absolute only thing standing between me and a padded cell. I plugged the USB cable into the side of the cheap computer. The screen flickered brightly, recognizing the external device. A black command prompt window immediately popped up on the screen, demanding a 32-character alphanumeric decryption key. Megan and her billionaire father had frozen my bank accounts and stolen my corporate identity, but they did not know the true foundation of the fortress they were trying to conquer. I stared at the blinking green cursor, letting my tired mind drift back to the brutal winter of 1985. Back then, Hayes Logistics was nothing more than 3 used delivery trucks and a freezing rented garage. I had walked into every major bank in the financial district wearing my only good suit, asking for a commercial loan to expand my small fleet. Every single bank manager, all of them wealthy white men with perfectly manicured hands, looked at my skin color and politely denied my application. They told me I was a high credit risk. They completely refused to give me a chance to succeed. So I stopped asking them for permission. I taught myself how to code late at night using a broken secondhand computer I bought from a local pawn shop. I built my own dispatch software and my own highly encrypted accounting ledgers because I knew the corporate system would never protect a man like me. The complex encryption algorithm protecting this hard drive was not purchased from a fancy cybersecurity firm. It was the exact same custom code I wrote in that freezing rented garage nearly 40 years ago. I placed my scarred fingers on the cheap plastic keyboard. Muscle memory took over completely. I typed out the long, complex string of characters, a unique sequence based on the engine serial numbers of my very first 3 trucks. I hit the enter key with a sharp strike. The black screen paused for a fraction of a second before flashing a bright green message that read, "Access granted." The digital vault finally opened. I bypassed the standard corporate folders and dug directly into the highly restricted administrative financial logs. The cheap laptop fan whirred loudly, struggling as it processed the massive amount of hidden data. I opened the shadow ledger, the true accounting record that tracked every single penny moving in and out of Hayes Logistics over the last decade. What I saw on the screen made my blood boil with a silent, violent rage. Megan had not just been skimming a little money off the top to fund a lavish lifestyle. She had been executing a highly coordinated, systematic financial slaughter of my entire life work. I traced the complex routing numbers from the Cayman Islands Trust back to our domestic operational accounts. Richard Thorne, her billionaire father, was actively drowning in massive debt. His luxury commercial real estate empire was heavily leveraged, and his ruthless creditors were calling in hundreds of millions in high-interest loans. To save his own skin from total bankruptcy, he was using his daughter to cannibalize my company. Over the past 3 months, while I was recovering from surgery, Megan had systematically redirected all our major vendor payments into fake offshore holding companies controlled entirely by her father. Furthermore, she had taken out massive high-interest corporate loans using the pristine credit rating of my company as collateral. The money from those toxic loans was immediately funneled straight into the failing development projects owned by Richard. They were not just stealing my profit margin. They were loading Hayes Logistics with so much toxic debt that the company would completely collapse and file for bankruptcy within a matter of weeks. When the federal financial investigators finally came looking for the missing millions, they would find my forged signature on every single loan application and wire transfer. Megan and Richard had engineered the absolute perfect financial crime. They were going to walk away with a massive fortune to save their own empire, and I was going to be locked in a state psychiatric ward, heavily sedated, and completely unable to testify or defend myself against the federal fraud charges. My son Kendrick was nothing more than a useful idiot, a human shield they were keeping around just long enough to process the illegal paperwork. The sheer scale of their betrayal was breathtaking. They viewed me as nothing more than a disposable asset to be drained and discarded into the trash. I kept digging through the internal communication logs, searching aggressively for the final nail in the coffin. I needed to know exactly what their ultimate exit strategy was. Elite criminals like Richard Thorne always had an exit strategy before lighting the match. I sorted through the deleted administrative emails, running a complex recovery script to pull back messages Megan thought she had permanently erased from the server. A highly encrypted email thread caught my eye immediately. It was sent directly from a private secure server owned by Richard to the corporate address of Megan just 3 days ago. The subject line simply read, "Project Liquidation." I opened the message with a heavy feeling in my chest. There was no polite greeting, just a set of explicit, ruthless instructions ordering Megan to finalize the transfer of the primary physical asset before the end of the fiscal quarter. Attached to the bottom of the email was a massive document. I clicked the file, waiting agonizing seconds for the slow processor of the cheap laptop to render the heavy pages. It was a legally binding commercial real estate sales contract. I stared at the property address listed in bold print on the very first page, feeling a cold, hard knot form deep in my stomach. It was the original deed to the Southside Freight Terminal. The Southside Freight Terminal was not just another warehouse. It was the beating heart of Hayes Logistics. It was the largest and most strategically located commercial distribution hub in the entire state. Owning that massive plot of land gave me absolute dominance over the regional supply chain. Megan and Richard were not just bleeding my company dry, they were selling the very ground it stood on to the highest bidder. The buyer listed on the contract was Apex Global, my biggest and most aggressive corporate rival. The executives at Apex had been trying to buy that terminal from me for 10 long years, and I had always laughed directly in their faces. Now Richard was selling it to them for a massive lump sum of cash to instantly wipe out his own real estate debts. I scrolled down quickly to the final page of the contract. There it was. My forged signature perfectly replicated in blue ink, sitting right next to the official stamp of a licensed notary public. The closing date for the sale was typed clearly at the bottom of the page. The final signing and transfer of funds was scheduled to take place in exactly 48 hours. If that contract was executed, Hayes Logistics would instantly cease to exist. I closed the laptop sharply. The countdown had officially started. 48 hours. That was all the time I had left before my company was sold off to my worst enemy. I could not fight this in a courtroom because I was legally classified as a mental patient. I needed physical evidence, the original hard copy of the shadow ledger, and I knew Richard Thorne kept all his dirty secrets locked inside his personal mansion. Tonight, Richard was hosting a massive charity gala at his sprawling estate in the wealthy hills above the city. The front gates were crawling with private security and valet drivers. But the wealthy always have a blind spot when it comes to the working class. They never look twice at the people serving them. I spent $50 at a uniform supply store and bought a dark blue industrial jumpsuit. I rented a refrigerated box truck and loaded it with 20 massive bags of crushed ice. At exactly 9 o'clock in the evening, I drove the heavy truck right up to the service entrance of the Thorne estate. The security guard barely glanced at my face. He saw the dirty uniform, he saw the ice, and he waved me right through the gate. I parked near the large catering tent set up on the back lawn. The kitchen staff was running around in pure chaos, carrying trays of expensive champagne and delicate appetizers. I grabbed 2 heavy bags of ice, threw them over my shoulder, and walked straight through the back doors directly into the kitchen of my enemy. I kept my head down and moved with the purposeful stride of a man who had a specific job to do. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked for my name or identification. I walked past the busy chefs and slipped into the quiet, dimly lit hallway of the main house. Richard Thorne thought his mansion was an impenetrable fortress, but he was dead wrong. 15 years ago, when this massive estate was being built, Hayes Logistics won the primary contract to transport all the high-end construction materials. I personally oversaw the delivery of the imported Italian marble and the heavy steel support beams. I had studied the architectural blueprints of this house for months to ensure my large trucks could navigate the steep driveway. I knew exactly where the master study was located, and more importantly, I knew exactly where the blind spots were in the interior security camera coverage. I bypassed the grand marble staircase and took the narrow wooden service stairs meant for the household staff. I navigated the second-floor hallway, stepping carefully on the very edge of the thick carpet to avoid making any sound. I reached the heavy oak double doors of the master study at the far end of the hall. The room was dark and completely silent. I stepped inside the study and locked the heavy doors behind me. The room smelled strongly of expensive cigars and aged leather. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I pulled a small pen light from my pocket and swept the narrow beam across the room. I found the wall safe hidden exactly where I expected it to be, behind a massive oil painting of a hunting dog. It was an older mechanical dial safe, the exact kind wealthy older men trust much more than modern digital keypads. I pressed my ear against the cold metal door and slowly turned the heavy brass dial. My fingers were calloused from decades of hard physical work, but they were still sensitive enough to feel the faint mechanical clicks of the tumblers falling into place. I took a deep breath and focused my mind entirely on the physical task in front of me. The intricate gears of the safe required absolute precision. I turned the dial left then right, feeling the subtle resistance of the internal locking mechanism. It was a delicate dance of patience and skill. My heart pounded heavily in my chest as the minutes ticked by in the dark room. Finally, I felt the last tumbler drop into place with a satisfying, heavy thud. It took me exactly 4 minutes to crack the combination. The heavy steel door swung open with a soft groan. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. This was it. The physical record of every illegal bribe and offshore transfer Richard Thorne had ever made. I slipped the heavy book into the deep pocket of my jumpsuit. I was just about to close the safe door when I heard the distinct sound of a key turning in the door lock. My heart stopped completely. I quickly pushed the painting back into place and dove behind the massive velvet curtains covering the floor-to-ceiling windows. The heavy oak doors swung open and the bright overhead lights snapped on. I held my breath, peering through a tiny slit in the thick fabric. My son Kendrick walked into the room looking pale and completely terrified. Megan walked in right behind him, slamming the heavy doors shut. "You are acting like a pathetic child," Megan hissed, her voice dripping with absolute venom. Kendrick ran his hands over his face, shaking his head rapidly. "I cannot do this anymore, Megan," he pleaded with her. "We are selling my father out completely. This is not just taking over the logistics company. We are destroying everything he built and committing federal fraud. I want to cancel the contract with Apex Global tomorrow morning." Megan did not yell. She walked calmly across the room and slapped Kendrick across the face with devastating force. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet study. Kendrick stumbled backward, holding his red cheek in pure shock. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Megan sneered, stepping closer to him until she was inches from his face. "My father has already leveraged everything on this deal. If you pull out now, he loses his entire empire and he will make sure you go down with him." "You are not canceling anything," she said in a low, terrifying whisper. "If you try to back out now, I will hand over the secondary ledger to the federal authorities. The ledger that shows you have been actively evading corporate taxes for the last 3 years to pay for your massive gambling debts. You will go to federal prison for a decade, and I will take everything you own in the divorce." I stood perfectly still behind the heavy velvet curtains, absorbing the crushing reality of the situation unfolding in front of me. I had spent the last 48 hours hoping that my son was just confused, hoping that he had been manipulated and desperately wanted a way out of this nightmare. But watching him cower in front of his vicious wife, I finally saw the undeniable truth. Kendrick was not an innocent victim. He was a weak, selfish coward who had compromised his own integrity long before Megan ever stepped into the picture. He had been stealing from my company for years to pay off secret gambling debts, and he had handed my entire legacy over to a monster just to save his own skin. All the love, protection, and sacrifice I had poured into him since he was a little boy had been a complete waste. He was truly beyond saving. Kendrick backed away from his wife, his hands trembling violently. He was sweating profusely, clearly unable to process the sheer magnitude of the trap he had walked into. He walked over to the antique wooden bar cart in the corner of the room to pour himself a glass of whiskey. His hands were shaking so badly that the heavy crystal glass slipped from his fingers and shattered loudly against the hardwood floor. Shards of glass and amber liquid splashed directly against the bottom of the velvet curtains where I was hiding. Kendrick looked down at the mess, his eyes slowly traveling up the dark fabric. He saw the heavy black boots of my work uniform protruding just beneath the curtain hem. His eyes widened in absolute terror. "Who is hiding there?" he shouted, stepping back in fear. I knew my cover was completely blown. I ripped the heavy curtain aside and stepped out into the bright light. Megan gasped loudly, her face turning pale white. Kendrick opened his mouth to scream for the security guards, but I did not give him the chance to make a sound. I lunged forward, grabbed my own son by the collar of his expensive tuxedo, and drove my right fist directly into his jaw. The impact was sickeningly solid. I did not feel a single ounce of regret as my knuckles connected with his face. This was not a father disciplining his child. This was a man eliminating a dangerous threat to his own survival. Kendrick collapsed, instantly hitting the floor completely unconscious. Megan backed against the locked door, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I had the ledger in my pocket, but I was now trapped inside the enemy base. I did not waste a single second looking down at my unconscious son lying on the floor. The heavy oak door rattled violently as Megan screamed for the security guards from the hallway outside. I shoved the thick leather ledger deep into the pocket of my jumpsuit and zipped it all the way up to my chin to secure it. I grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the study desk and smashed it completely through the thick glass of the floor-to-ceiling window. The freezing night air instantly rushed into the room, blowing the velvet curtains wildly. I could hear the heavy boots of the private security team running up the main marble staircase toward the study. I did not hesitate at all. I climbed onto the windowsill and threw my body out into the pitch-black night. I fell past the second-floor balcony and crashed hard into the giant pine trees located directly outside the window. The sharp pine needles tore at my face and my hands, but the thick branches broke my fall just enough to save my life. I dropped the last 10 feet and hit the soft soil rolling over my shoulder to absorb the brutal impact. A sharp pain shot through my left knee, but the massive adrenaline completely masked the worst of the injury. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted across the perfectly manicured lawn, heading straight for the dense tree line at the edge of the Thorne estate. Loud security sirens began blaring behind me, echoing loudly across the quiet hills. Bright white floodlights snapped on, sweeping across the green grass. I dove into the thick brush just as a beam of light passed directly over my head. I was completely surrounded in enemy territory, and the hunt had officially begun. The forest surrounding the estate was absolutely massive, stretching for miles and miles across the steep residential hills. It was pitch black under the thick canopy of ancient oak and pine trees. Running blindly through the dense woods in the dark was a guaranteed way to break an ankle or fall into a deep ravine. But I was not just a corporate executive sitting in a comfortable boardroom. Decades before I ever wore tailored suits, I was a young Marine navigating the deadly jungles of Southeast Asia. I stopped running for a moment and leaned heavily against the rough bark of a large tree to catch my breath. I looked straight up through the dark branches, searching the night sky for the one thing I could absolutely trust in the wilderness. I found the Orion constellation, and from there I easily located the North Star. My military survival skills instantly kicked in, completely overriding the fear and exhaustion burning in my chest. I knew the main public highway was located exactly 2 miles south of this position. If I kept the North Star directly at my back, I would eventually hit the paved road where I had a real chance to disappear into the city. I steadied my breathing and began moving south, stepping incredibly carefully to avoid snapping any dry branches that could easily give away my exact position to the armed men hunting me in the dark. I had only covered about half a mile when I heard the most terrifying sound a prey can possibly hear in the dark woods. The deep, aggressive barking of trained tracking hounds echoed sharply through the freezing forest air. Richard had not just sent his private security force after me. He had released his professional guard dogs to hunt me down. I forced my exhausted legs to move faster, pushing aggressively through thick, thorny bushes that tore at my heavy jumpsuit and scratched my arms. The dogs were moving incredibly fast, their loud barks growing closer and more aggressive with every single passing minute. I could see the bright beams of high-powered flashlights sweeping through the trees right behind me, scanning the dark forest floor for any sign of my footprints. The security guards were shouting harsh orders to each other, forming a tight perimeter to trap me against the steep eastern ridge of the property. My lungs burned like fire with every breath, and my injured knee was rapidly beginning to fail me. I reached the edge of a steep, muddy embankment and slid all the way down, stumbling repeatedly in the wet dirt and dead leaves. The hunting dogs were less than 100 yards away now. I could hear them snapping thick branches and crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. I hit the bottom of the ravine and kept running, following the natural downward slope of the land toward the valley. The tree line finally began to thin out, and I saw the dim, amber glow of the highway streetlights shining in the distance. Pushing my aging body to its absolute physical limit, I burst out of the woods and stumbled onto the gravel shoulder of the empty road. The hounds tore through the brush right behind me, baring their sharp teeth and snarling viciously. The lead dog, a massive black shepherd, lunged straight for my chest. Suddenly, the blinding headlights of a heavy commercial vehicle swept across the dark pavement. A massive industrial garbage truck slammed hard on its air brakes, sliding sideways across the wet asphalt with a deafening screech that echoed through the night. The heavy steel front bumper of the truck clipped the lead dog, knocking the aggressive animal back into the ditch. The passenger door of the truck flew open immediately. Hector, the old janitor from my corporate building, was sitting behind the wheel with a fierce and determined look on his weathered face. "Get in the truck, Harrison," he shouted at the top of his lungs over the loud roar of the massive diesel engine. I grabbed the cold metal handle and hauled my exhausted body up into the high cabin just as the security guards burst out of the tree line with their weapons drawn and pointed at us. Hector slammed his heavy boot on the gas pedal. The large tires spun aggressively on the gravel before catching traction and launching the massive truck down the empty highway. I collapsed heavily into the torn vinyl seat, gasping for air as the dark forest and the angry guards quickly disappeared in the rearview mirror. Hector did not ask any questions about what happened. He just kept his eyes glued to the dark road and drove the heavy machine as fast as it could possibly go. The intense and steady vibrations of the massive truck slowly calmed my racing heart. We were miles away from the Thorne estate, now heading deep into the industrial warehouse district where the city police rarely patrolled. I sat up slowly in the passenger seat and wiped the cold sweat and dark dirt from my bleeding face. I unzipped my heavy jumpsuit and reached deep into the chest pocket. My fingers touched the smooth leather cover of the ledger I had successfully stolen from the wall safe. This was the ultimate weapon I needed. This single book held all the financial evidence I required to completely destroy Megan and her corrupt father. I pulled the heavy ledger out and placed it carefully on my lap. The inside of the truck cabin was illuminated only by the faint green glow of the dashboard dials. I flicked on the small overhead reading light and took a deep breath. I opened the thick leather cover, fully expecting to see neat handwritten columns of numbers, wire transfers, and offshore bank routing codes. I stared down at the first page, and every single ounce of hope left in my body instantly evaporated into thin air. There were no bank account numbers on the paper. There were no corporate names or financial records. Every single page of the thick ledger was filled from top to bottom with random, chaotic strings of alphanumeric characters. It looked like a completely meaningless foreign language. I flipped frantically through the pages, my hands shaking with a fresh wave of panic and dread. Every page was exactly the same. Richard Thorne was a ruthless and greedy man, but he was absolutely not a complete fool. He had not recorded his illegal financial transactions in plain text for anyone to read. He had run his entire shadow ledger through a highly advanced military-grade encryption software, printing the ciphered text out and binding it into a physical book to completely prevent digital hackers from accessing it remotely. This book was completely useless to me without the original digital decryption key. I could not take this evidence to the federal authorities because it proved absolutely nothing in a court of law. It was just a heavy book filled with random letters and numbers. I slammed the leather cover shut in pure frustration. I had risked my life, knocked out my own son, and been hunted like a wild animal just to get a weapon I could not even use. I looked over at Hector, who was watching me with deep concern in his eyes. "I need a hacker," I told him quietly over the engine noise. "I need the best digital criminal in this entire city." I told Hector to steer the heavy garbage truck toward the abandoned shipyard district on the far east side of the city. I knew exactly where to find the man I needed. His name was Dexter. 10 years ago, Dexter was the most brilliant software engineer working in the cybersecurity division of my logistics company. He was a digital genius, but he was also deeply arrogant and reckless. I caught him running an illegal data mining operation using the private servers of my business. I did not just fire him that day. I completely blacklisted him from the entire corporate tech industry. Now he lived in the dark corners of the city building custom malware for organized crime syndicates. Hector parked the massive truck in a dark alley behind a crumbling brick warehouse. I thanked the old janitor for saving my life and told him to disappear before the police found the stolen vehicle. I climbed out of the cabin and walked down a flight of cracked concrete stairs leading to a heavy steel door in the basement of the warehouse. I knocked 3 times in a slow and deliberate rhythm. The heavy metal deadbolt clicked loudly and the door swung open slowly, revealing a dark room filled with glowing computer monitors. Dexter stood in the doorway looking exactly like a hostile ghost from my past. I stepped into the dim light of the doorway so he could see the blood and dirt on my face. Dexter stared at me with pure hatred burning in his eyes. He had aged terribly since the day I threw him out of my corporate headquarters. His face was pale and covered in a messy beard, and his clothes hung loosely on his thin frame. I ruined his life, and he never forgot it. When I blacklisted him, he lost his luxury apartment, his expensive car, and his entire professional reputation. He was forced to scrape a living from the absolute bottom of the criminal underworld. The silence in the dark hallway was heavy and dangerous. He looked at my torn industrial jumpsuit and the heavy leather ledger tucked under my arm. He smiled a very cold and bitter smile. He knew I was in deep trouble. The wealthy and powerful Harrison Hayes did not show up at a basement door in the middle of the night unless his empire was burning to the ground. He stepped back and motioned for me to enter his digital cave. The room was filled with the loud humming sound of massive cooling fans and dozens of high-powered computer servers stacked from the floor to the ceiling. As soon as I stepped past the threshold, Dexter slammed the heavy steel door shut and locked the deadbolt. I turned around to face him and found myself staring directly down the dark barrel of a 9mm handgun. Dexter held the weapon with both hands, pointing it squarely at the center of my forehead. His finger was resting heavily on the trigger. He told me he had waited 10 long years for the opportunity to watch me die. His voice was shaking with decades of suppressed rage. He said he could pull the trigger right now and drop my body into the toxic river behind the warehouse, and absolutely nobody would ever care. I stood perfectly still. I did not blink, and I did not raise my hands in surrender. I looked right past the gun and stared directly into his angry eyes. I knew he was a desperate man, and desperate men are always driven by greed rather than murder. I slowly reached into the deep pocket of my heavy coat. Dexter tensed up and warned me to freeze, but I ignored him. I pulled out the thick stack of $100 bills I had received from the pawn shop earlier that morning. It was exactly $8,000 in untraceable cash. I tossed the heavy stack of money onto the metal table next to his computer keyboards. I told him that was just the down payment for his immediate services. I placed the thick leather ledger right next to the cash. I explained that my entire company was being stolen by a ruthless billionaire, and this book contained the encrypted financial data needed to destroy him. Dexter lowered the gun slightly, looking at the cash and the ledger. I did not stop talking. I told him I needed him to break a military-grade physical cipher. I promised him that if he successfully decoded the pages of this book, I would give him a permanent seat on my board of directors and a full 5% equity stake in Hayes Logistics once I took my empire back. That was a completely life-changing amount of wealth. It was enough money to pull him out of this dark basement forever and put him back in the high-rise luxury world he had lost 10 years ago. The room fell totally silent except for the loud humming of the computer fans. Dexter looked at the gun in his hand and then looked at the stack of money on his table. The pure hatred in his eyes slowly shifted into calculated greed. He carefully placed the handgun on the desk and picked up the leather ledger. He flipped through the dense pages of alphanumeric code, and a slow, confident smile spread across his face. He told me to sit down and keep quiet because this was going to take a very long time. I pulled up a folding chair and watched as the devil I created began to work for me. Dexter worked relentlessly through the rest of the night and deep into the following day. I sat in the dark basement watching the digital clocks on his monitors slowly tick forward. The physical exhaustion in my body was absolute, but I refused to close my eyes. Dexter used a series of high-resolution scanners to digitize every single page of the thick leather book. He then fed the massive text file into a custom decryption algorithm he wrote specifically to attack the cipher. For 12 agonizing hours, the computer servers roared loudly as they processed millions of possible cryptographic combinations. The air in the room grew incredibly hot and stale. Finally, at exactly 4 p.m, a loud chime echoed through the basement. The chaotic strings of letters and numbers on the main monitor suddenly shifted and rearranged themselves into perfectly clear text. The decryption was complete. We had the banking records. I leaned over his shoulder to read the glowing screen. The evidence was absolutely damning. It listed every single offshore account and illegal wire transfer Richard Thorne had ever executed. But my victory lasted for exactly 3 seconds. The main computer monitor suddenly flashed a violent and blinding red color. A loud digital alarm began shrieking through the speakers. Dexter jumped back from the keyboard with a look of pure panic on his face. He frantically typed lines of code trying to kill the system, but it was too late. Richard Thorne had planted a highly aggressive digital tripwire inside the physical ciphertext. By scanning and decoding the document, we had unknowingly activated a dormant tracking malware that instantly broadcasted our exact global positioning coordinates directly to the enemy servers. We were completely exposed. Before Dexter could pull the power cords from the wall, the heavy steel door at the top of the concrete stairs began to violently shake. The deafening sound of heavy battering rams slamming against the metal echoed through the basement. I could hear the harsh, aggressive shouts of the tactical police units and the private security contractors Megan had sent to eliminate me. The heavy hinges on the basement door began to tear away from the concrete wall. They had found us, and there was absolutely no way out. Dexter did not hesitate for a single second when the heavy battering rams began smashing against the steel door. He grabbed a massive iron crowbar from the corner of his messy desk and completely ignored the armed men screaming on the other side of the wall. He swung the heavy iron bar down with brutal force, targeting a rusted steel grate on the floor hidden under an old rug. The rusted metal shattered into pieces, revealing a dark and narrow concrete tunnel leading straight down into the ancient underground sewer system of the city. The heavy hinges of the basement door finally gave way with a deafening crash that shook the entire room. Heavily armed private security contractors flooded into the small basement with their tactical rifles raised and their lasers sweeping across the dark room. I did not wait another second to see their faces or listen to their violent threats. I dove headfirst into that narrow, dark hole right behind Dexter. We slid down a steep concrete pipe and plunged into freezing cold water that reached all the way up to our knees. High above us, I could hear the angry shouts of the armed men echoing down the tunnel as they realized the room was completely empty. We waded through the thick, toxic sludge of the underground tunnels, moving blindly in total darkness for what felt like an absolute eternity. The smell of the ancient sewer was absolutely disgusting, but it was the undeniable scent of survival. We finally reached a rusted iron ladder leading up to a heavy manhole cover located right on the street level. Dexter pushed it open heavily, and we pulled our exhausted bodies up to the surface into the freezing rain of an empty industrial alley. We had successfully escaped the immediate death trap, but the real war was far from over. Standing in the freezing rain, I felt the familiar cold chill of a predator instinct running down my spine. When you back a dangerous and desperate animal into a corner, they do not just bite back with physical violence. They try to completely destroy your reputation and your credibility before you can ever tell your side of the story. In the ruthless world of corporate business, the first person to control the public narrative usually wins the entire war. Megan and Richard were not just going to send armed thugs to kill me in the dark. They needed to legitimize this hostile takeover in the broad daylight. I knew exactly what they were going to do next because I had seen these exact ruthless tactics used by desperate executives before. They were going to weaponize the media against me. Back when I first built my company, I learned the bitter lesson that public perception holds just as much power as financial capital. I had spent 4 decades building a flawless reputation as a hardworking and incredibly honest businessman. Megan knew that as long as the public respected my name, my sudden disappearance would raise massive suspicions with my employees and the local authorities. She needed to quickly turn me into a terrifying monster so that absolutely nobody would ask any questions when I was locked inside a mental asylum or found dead in an empty alley. Dexter and I cautiously stepped out of the dark industrial alley and made our way toward a busy commercial street located on the edge of the financial district. Morning commuters were rushing past us, trying to hold their umbrellas against the freezing rain. Suddenly, the massive digital billboard towering over the busy city intersection flickered and completely changed its morning broadcast. I froze dead in my tracks and let the freezing rain hit my face. My own face was looking back at me from that massive high-definition screen. It was not a professional corporate portrait taken from the company website. It was a grainy security camera photo with the words "National Fugitive" flashing in bright red capital letters across the bottom of the screen. The news broadcast immediately cut to a live press conference taking place on the front steps of the local police headquarters. Megan was standing in front of dozens of news reporters and flashing camera lights, looking absolutely devastated. She was not wearing her expensive designer clothes or her heavy diamond jewelry. She wore a simple dark sweater and absolutely no makeup on her face, making her look like a terrified and highly vulnerable victim. She was crying hysterically while gripping the microphones on the podium with trembling hands. "My father-in-law has suffered a complete mental breakdown and has completely lost his mind," she sobbed loudly for the national television cameras. His terminal dementia has reached a highly violent and paranoid stage that we can no longer control. Last night he broke into our secure family home and brutally attacked my husband Kendrick, beating him until he was completely unconscious. He then broke into the private office of a family friend and stole highly classified corporate documents, believing they are part of a massive conspiracy against him. The television cameras zoomed in closely on her face as she wiped away perfectly calculated fake tears. He is incredibly dangerous and totally out of touch with reality, she warned the watching public with a shaking voice. We are begging anyone who sees him to contact the police immediately before he hurts himself or another innocent person. Do not approach him under any circumstances. I stared at the massive screen in absolute horror and silent rage. The people walking on the wet sidewalks around me all stopped to watch the breaking news report. A young woman holding a coffee cup looked up at the digital screen and then looked directly at me standing under the streetlight. Her eyes went wide with absolute terror as she recognized my bruised face. She dropped her coffee cup onto the wet asphalt and started screaming for the police at the top of her lungs. Dexter grabbed my arm and violently pulled me back into the shadows of the alley before the crowd could surround us. I was no longer just a missing corporate executive. I was a highly dangerous fugitive being hunted by every law enforcement officer in the state. I was completely trapped by a lie that the entire world now believed was the absolute truth. My cheap burner phone vibrated violently inside the wet pocket of my heavy jumpsuit. I pulled it out and saw my ruthless lawyer Nathaniel Reed calling on a secure encrypted line. I answered the phone immediately, hoping he had formulated a brilliant legal backup plan. Nathaniel sounded completely exhausted and defeated. "Harrison," he said in a grim tone, "I just watched the morning press conference. Things have officially gone from a bad situation to a complete legal catastrophe." I quickly told him that I had successfully stolen the physical ledger from Richard Thorne and that it contained the encrypted evidence of the massive financial fraud. Nathaniel let out a heavy sigh that chilled me to the bone. "That does not matter anymore, Harrison," he explained harshly. "That ledger is stolen property, and you are now a wanted fugitive with a highly publicized medical diagnosis of violent dementia. If I walk into a federal courtroom and try to submit a stolen and encrypted book given to me by a violent mental patient, the judge will throw me in prison for obstruction of justice. This ledger is completely useless as legal evidence right now. We are completely out of legal ammunition." Nathaniel continued, his voice dropping to a rough and desperate whisper. "Megan has completely outmaneuvered us on the legal battlefield. She holds the fake medical documents, the police arrest warrants, and the entire media narrative in her manipulative hands. She is using this massive public distraction to deliver the final killing blow to your entire life work." I asked him what he meant by that. Nathaniel explained that the emergency board meeting to sign the final real estate transfer had been officially scheduled for exactly 2:00 tomorrow afternoon. Megan and Richard were going to sit down with the rival corporate executives in the main boardroom of your company headquarters. Once your son Kendrick signs that legally binding contract, the Southside Freight Terminal is gone forever. The massive payout will instantly vanish into untraceable offshore accounts, and your company will permanently die. You have exactly 24 hours left to stop this, Harrison, Nathaniel warned me before hanging up the phone. No courtroom in this country will hear your case after tomorrow. If the pen hits the paper at 2:00 tomorrow afternoon, your entire legacy will be completely wiped off the map. You have to find another way. I stood in the freezing rain staring down at the wet pavement after Nathaniel hung up the phone. I was completely out of legal options, and I had exactly 24 hours before my entire empire was sold to my worst enemy. I pulled the hood of my heavy coat over my head and told Dexter to wait for me in the dark alley. I needed to go to the only place in the city where I could actually think clearly without the constant fear of being hunted. I walked for 2 miles through the gray morning light, avoiding the main commercial roads and keeping my head down whenever a police cruiser drove past with its sirens wailing. The physical pain in my knee was throbbing with every single step, but I forced myself to keep moving forward. I finally reached the high, wrought iron gates of the Oak Hill Cemetery. The sprawling graveyard was completely empty in the freezing rain, providing me with a perfect sanctuary away from the chaotic city. I walked silently along the winding gravel paths, passing rows of old monuments, until I reached a quiet green hill overlooking the distant city skyline. I stood in front of a smooth, black marble headstone and looked down at the name carved deep into the wet stone. It was my late wife, Corinne. She had been my absolute rock during the hardest years of my life, and I desperately needed her unwavering strength right now. I fell to my knees in the wet grass and placed my cold hands on her headstone. I told her I was completely cornered and that the wolves were finally breaking down our doors. I closed my eyes and let the rain wash over my face, waiting for an answer from the only person I ever truly trusted. As I knelt there in the freezing rain, a sudden and incredibly vivid memory flashed through my exhausted mind with absolute clarity. It was a serious conversation Corinne and I had exactly 20 years ago, sitting at our small kitchen table late at night while our son was sleeping upstairs. Corinne was not just a loving and supportive wife, she was an incredibly brilliant woman who understood the ruthless nature of corporate law much better than I ever did. She knew that as Hayes Logistics grew larger and more profitable, it would eventually attract vicious corporate predators and greedy investors who would try to tear our family apart for their own financial gain. She told me that we needed to build an invisible and impenetrable fortress around our most valuable corporate assets. She insisted that we completely separate the physical real estate from the daily operational logistics business. Working closely with a private estate lawyer, she quietly established an independent charitable foundation in her own name. She did it entirely in secret to ensure that no corporate rival could ever use our business debts to seize the ground beneath our feet. My eyes snapped open as the absolute brilliance of her defensive strategy hit me like a bolt of lightning. I pushed myself up from the wet grass and ran all the way back to the industrial alley where Dexter was waiting anxiously. I told him we needed to get to the County Hall of Records immediately before the afternoon shift change. We took a series of crowded public buses to reach the old municipal district in the center of the city, keeping our heads down to avoid the security cameras on the transit system. I pulled my baseball cap down low over my eyes and wore a cheap pair of reading glasses I bought at a corner store to disguise my bruised and battered face. The county archives building was a massive stone structure filled with endless rows of heavy metal filing cabinets and dusty property registers. It was a completely obsolete facility in the modern digital age, but it held the original paper deeds that could never be hacked or altered by Richard Thorne and his expensive lawyers. I walked right past the sleeping security guard at the front desk and headed straight for the basement archives where the commercial real estate records were securely stored. The old clerk sitting at the reference desk was busy reading a newspaper and did not even glance up at my face when I walked past him. I walked down the narrow aisles of towering metal shelves, scanning the heavy leather-bound index books for the specific parcel number of the Southside Freight Terminal. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I finally pulled the massive ledger from the bottom shelf and slammed it onto a wooden reading table under a flickering fluorescent light. The thick pages were yellow and brittle with decades of age. I traced my finger down the long columns of property transfers and legal deeds until I found the exact entry for the terminal property. There it was written in bold black ink and stamped with the official seal of the county clerk. Hayes Logistics did not own the Southside Freight Terminal. We had never owned it. The massive plot of land belonged entirely to the Corinne Hayes Charitable Trust. The logistics company was merely a tenant paying a long-term commercial lease to the charity every single year. The sheer magnitude of this legal revelation completely shifted the balance of power in this war. Megan and Richard were planning to sell the terminal to Apex Global tomorrow afternoon to instantly wipe out their massive real estate debts. But you simply cannot sell a piece of property that your company does not legally own. The entire corporate takeover was built on a massive fundamental flaw. They had stolen my bank accounts and locked me out of my own headquarters, but they had absolutely no legal authority to sell the ground beneath the warehouse. The property deed belonged to my late wife, and her trust was completely immune to the fake medical power of attorney Megan had filed with the bank. I stared at the dusty page and felt a massive wave of triumph wash over my tired body. The ghost of my brilliant wife had just handed me the ultimate weapon to completely destroy our enemies. But my brief moment of victory was quickly interrupted by a cold and terrifying realization that sent a chill down my spine. Megan was an incredibly meticulous and ruthless woman who left absolutely nothing to chance. She and her father would have thoroughly checked the municipal property deeds before arranging a massive corporate buyout with a powerful rival company like Apex Global. They must have discovered that the land was officially owned by the charitable trust. To legally execute the massive sale tomorrow afternoon, they needed to prove that Hayes Logistics had the legal right to transfer the property ownership. There was absolutely only one way they could possibly achieve that in such a short amount of time. Megan must have forged a secondary legal document. She must have completely falsified a permanent transfer of the land from the charitable trust back to the logistics company. She had already forged my signature on the complex medical documents, so forging my signature as the sole acting trustee of the charity would be incredibly easy for her. I knew my forged signature alone would not be enough to stop the massive sale from happening. Because of her aggressive national media campaign and the fake medical records, any federal judge would simply assume I was a crazy and violent old man denying my own legitimate signature. I needed to aggressively attack the absolute foundation of the forged document itself. Any legal transfer of commercial real estate required the official stamp and signature of a state-licensed notary public. I closed my eyes and mentally visualized the digital copy of the sales contract I had seen on the encrypted hard drive back at the cheap motel room. I clearly remembered seeing the round blue ink stamp of the notary located right next to my forged signature on the final page of the contract. The specific name printed on that official seal belonged to an independent notary named Elias. He was an old associate of mine who handled a massive amount of corporate paperwork in the financial district. If Megan forged the property transfer document, she had to use a fake notary stamp to make it look completely official to the buyers. If I could physically locate Elias and prove that the blue stamp on her contract was a complete fraudulent forgery, the entire land sale would immediately become a massive federal crime. I finally had a target and the clock was ticking down fast. I grabbed Dexter by the shoulder and pulled him out of the dusty archives building as fast as my injured leg could possibly carry me. We could not take the public bus this time because we desperately needed absolute speed and maneuverability. Dexter used his old connections in the criminal underworld to quickly locate and secure a stolen black sedan parked in a nearby commercial alleyway. We jumped into the cold vehicle and Dexter immediately slammed his heavy boot on the gas pedal. The powerful engine roared loudly as we tore through the crowded city streets, heading straight for the quiet suburban neighborhood where the old notary lived. The heavy gray rain continued to pour down from the dark sky, washing over the windshield in violent sheets. I sat in the passenger seat, staring intensely at the wet road ahead. Elias was an honest man who lived a very quiet and peaceful life, and I knew that Megan and Richard would absolutely not hesitate to silence him permanently if they realized he was the only loose end in their perfect corporate crime. Richard Thorne employed highly trained private military contractors who specialized in making inconvenient people disappear without a single trace. We were racing against a ticking clock, and the stakes had never been higher in my entire life. I told Dexter to run every single red light and completely ignore the speed limits because paying a traffic ticket was the absolute least of our current problems. The dark suburban houses blurred past our windows rapidly as we approached the specific street where the notary lived. I knew we were absolutely not going to be walking into a friendly conversation. I turned to Dexter and demanded that he hand over the 9mm handgun he had pointed at my head the night before. He did not argue with me or ask any questions. He pulled the cold, heavy weapon from his waistband and placed it firmly in my hands. I ejected the metal magazine and carefully checked the brass ammunition, pressing my thumb against the top round to ensure it was seated properly. I slammed the magazine back into the black grip and racked the heavy steel slide, chambering the first round with a satisfying mechanical click. My military combat training from decades ago flooded back into my veins, completely washing away the exhaustion and the intense physical pain. I was no longer a wealthy corporate executive fighting a slow legal battle in a comfortable boardroom. I was a desperate soldier preparing to aggressively breach an active combat zone. I flicked the safety switch off and held the cold weapon low against my chest. Dexter parked the stolen sedan 2 houses away from the target location, and we quietly stepped out into the freezing rain. The front door of the small suburban house was completely shattered. The heavy wooden frame was violently splintered and hanging loosely from its metal hinges. We were already too late. Richard Thorne and his ruthless men had beaten us to the target. I signaled for Dexter to stay outside in the rain and watch the street while I moved silently up the concrete steps. I pressed my back tightly against the wet exterior wall and peeked through the broken doorway. The living room was completely destroyed. Heavy furniture was overturned and shattered glass covered the expensive hardwood floor. 3 massive men wearing black tactical gear were standing in the center of the room. They had Elias tied tightly to a wooden dining chair. The old man was bleeding heavily from his face and gasping weakly for air. One of the brutal thugs was holding a heavy steel wrench, preparing to strike the terrified notary again, while the other 2 were aggressively ransacking the desk drawers looking for his official records. They were trying to completely destroy his original notary logbook to erase any physical proof of the forged property transfer. I did not issue a warning, and I did not ask them to surrender. I stepped through the broken doorway and raised my weapon with deadly precision. I fired 2 rapid shots directly into the chest of the massive man holding the steel wrench. He dropped instantly to the floor without making a single sound. The deafening roar of the gunshot echoed violently in the small enclosed room. The other 2 thugs spun around, reaching for their holstered weapons in sheer panic. I did not give them a fraction of a second to react. I lunged forward quickly, closing the distance between us before they could draw their guns. I drove the heavy steel barrel of my handgun directly into the face of the second man, shattering his nose and knocking him completely unconscious against the painted wall. The third man managed to pull his weapon, but I grabbed his wrist with my left hand and twisted it violently until I heard the bone snap loudly. He screamed in agonizing pain, dropping his gun to the floor. I swept his heavy boots out from under him and struck him hard on the back of the neck, rendering him completely immobilized on the broken glass. The entire violent encounter lasted less than 10 seconds. The room fell completely silent except for the heavy breathing of the old notary tied to the chair. I quickly untied the thick ropes binding his hands and helped him sit up straight on the broken chair. Elias coughed heavily and looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. I told him we did not have time for lengthy explanations and quickly pulled the cheap burner laptop from my bag. I opened the digital file containing the forged real estate contract Megan had submitted to the bank. I zoomed in closely on the round blue notary stamp located right next to my forged signature and turned the glowing screen toward the injured old man. I asked him to look very closely at his own official seal. Elias wiped the dark blood from his eyes and squinted at the bright screen. He studied the blue ink mark for a few tense seconds before a weak but triumphant smile appeared on his bruised face. He pointed a trembling finger at the outer edge of the circular stamp on the screen. He told me to look at the very top of the blue circle. There was a tiny microscopic break in the solid blue line of the stamp. Elias explained that he had accidentally dropped his heavy brass notary stamp on a hard concrete floor exactly 1 year ago, causing a microscopic chip in the metal rim. Every single legal document he notarized after that specific date carried that exact same tiny physical flaw. I looked at the date typed clearly at the top of the forged contract. Megan had backdated the property transfer by 3 full years to make it look like Corinne had signed the valuable land over long before her charitable trust was fully established. She had backdated the document by 3 years, but she had carelessly used the damaged stamp that only broke 1 year ago. It was a massive and completely undeniable physical paradox. The document was an absolute fraud, and we finally had the ironclad forensic proof needed to completely destroy her perfect crime. But having the solid evidence was only half the battle. I looked up at the broken wall clock hanging in the ruined living room. It was exactly 1:15 in the afternoon. The emergency board meeting to sign the final sale with Apex Global was scheduled to begin at 2:00 sharp. We had exactly 45 minutes to get past an army of private security guards and violently breach the corporate boardroom before my entire empire was sold forever. I left Elias sitting safely in his ruined living room and sprinted back out to the stolen black sedan where Dexter was waiting anxiously behind the wheel. I told him to slide over to the passenger seat because I needed absolute control over the vehicle for what we were about to do. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly and slammed my heavy boot completely down on the gas pedal. The powerful engine roared as we tore out of the quiet suburban neighborhood and merged aggressively onto the main highway, heading straight back into the heart of the financial district. The dashboard clock glowed a menacing bright red, showing exactly 1:30 in the afternoon. We had exactly 30 minutes before the fake property transfer became a permanent legal reality. The heavy freezing rain continued to pound relentlessly against the windshield, blurring the towering glass skyscrapers of the city skyline in the distance. As we rapidly approached the main access road leading to the Hayes Logistics corporate campus, I saw exactly what I had feared the most. The main avenue was completely blocked by temporary steel barricades and heavily armed private security vehicles. Megan had fully anticipated my desperate return and fortified the entire perimeter. I did not hit the brakes. I told Dexter to brace his body and I gripped the wheel even tighter. I aimed the heavy steel grille of the sedan directly at the weakest point connecting the metal fences. We hit the barricade at over 60 miles per hour. The heavy steel fence buckled and shattered violently, sending sharp metal debris flying across the wet pavement as we violently breached the outer perimeter of my own company. The stolen sedan spun wildly on the wet asphalt before I finally wrestled it to a harsh stop in the deep shadows of an adjacent parking garage. We could go absolutely no further in the vehicle. The entire central plaza of the corporate headquarters was completely locked down. I could see dozens of local police cruisers parked near the main glass entrance alongside the massive black armored vehicles belonging to Richard Thorne and his private military contractors. They were heavily armed and actively patrolling the perimeter with aggressive attack dogs. There was absolutely no way I could walk through those front doors without being instantly shot or arrested by the local authorities. Suddenly, the massive steel rolling doors of the underground loading dock slowly began to open. A massive industrial garbage truck rolled out into the pouring rain. It was Hector. I instantly recognized the faded identification number painted on the side of the heavy cab. I abandoned the stolen sedan and sprinted through the freezing rain, waving my arms frantically. Hector slammed on the air brakes and threw open the passenger side door. I climbed up and quickly explained the impossible situation. Hector did not hesitate for a single second. He told me the only way past the underground security checkpoint was hidden inside the massive steel compactor in the back of his truck. I climbed over the back of the heavy truck cabin and lowered myself down into the dark and massive steel compactor. The smell was absolutely horrific. It was a suffocating and toxic mixture of rotting food chemicals and wet cardboard. I forced my battered body deep into the center of the foul pile, pulling heavy bags of industrial waste completely over my head to hide my face and my dark uniform. The heavy hydraulic press of the truck was locked in the open position, giving me just enough space to breathe, but the steel walls felt like a freezing metal coffin closing in around me. Hector engaged the heavy diesel engine, and the truck began to slowly roll down the steep concrete ramp leading directly into the subterranean loading docks of the corporate tower. I lay perfectly still under the freezing trash, listening to the heavy tires rolling over the concrete speed bumps. Suddenly, the truck stopped abruptly. I heard the harsh, muffled voices of the private security guards aggressively interrogating Hector. They demanded to know exactly why he was returning to the loading dock during a corporate lockdown. Hector calmly lied and told them his hydraulic compactor was jamming and he desperately needed to run a manual diagnostic check in the maintenance bay. I heard the heavy boots of a security guard walking slowly down the side of the truck. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. The guard hit the side of the steel compactor with his heavy metal flashlight. He strictly ordered Hector to run the massive vehicle through the underground X-ray scanner before proceeding any further into the secure facility. The massive engine roared again, and the truck rolled slowly forward onto the heavy scanning platform. I knew the high-powered imaging sensors would sweep straight through the thin steel walls of the truck bed. I pressed my body completely flat against the freezing metal floor and tucked my arms and legs tight against my torso, doing everything I possibly could to make my physical silhouette blend in with the dense piles of trash. The deep humming sound of the massive scanner vibrated intensely through the steel floorboards, rattling my teeth. I held my breath until my lungs burned desperately for oxygen. For 30 agonizing seconds, the machine scanned the vehicle. The humming finally stopped. I heard the security guard shout a clear command, giving Hector permission to enter the loading bay. The truck rolled forward and parked deep inside the massive underground facility. I waited until I heard Hector tap 3 times on the side of the steel container. I pushed the heavy bags of wet garbage off my body and climbed over the metal edge, dropping quietly onto the solid concrete floor of the loading dock. The area was completely deserted because the regular maintenance staff had been cleared out for the emergency board meeting. I thanked Hector with a silent nod and moved swiftly toward the heavy industrial freight elevator located at the far end of the dock. This specific elevator bypassed the main lobby entirely and led straight to the executive penthouse on the top floor. I swiped my master access card, which was miraculously still active on the isolated freight network, and the heavy metal doors slid shut. The elevator began its long, slow ascent to the top of the tower. The digital display above the metal doors quietly counted the floors as the heavy freight elevator climbed higher and higher into the glass tower. 40, 45, 50. My entire body was bruised, bleeding, and completely soaked in freezing rain and toxic garbage. I reached into my heavy pocket and gripped the cold steel of the 9mm handgun, keeping my finger resting safely alongside the trigger guard. I also felt the solid weight of the digital laptop containing the absolute proof of the forged notary stamp. The elevator finally reached the top floor with a soft mechanical chime. The heavy steel doors slowly slid open, revealing the pristine marble hallway of the executive level. I stepped out of the elevator completely prepared to sprint toward the main boardroom, but I did not even make it 2 steps. A massive figure stepped out from behind the decorative marble pillar located directly in front of the elevator doors. It was the private security captain Megan had personally hired to replace my loyal men. He raised a heavy tactical pistol and pressed the cold steel barrel directly against the center of my chest. The security captain stared at me with completely dead eyes. He was a highly trained mercenary who did not care about corporate politics or family betrayal. He only cared about the massive paycheck Richard Thorne was depositing into his offshore bank account. He did not ask me to surrender my weapon. He did not tell me to put my hands in the air or get down on the cold marble floor. He just stood there with his heavy boots planted firmly on the ground, pressing the cold barrel of his weapon harder against my breastbone. "You should have stayed hidden in the dark, old man," he whispered coldly. The instructions he had received from Megan were completely clear and absolutely ruthless. He had been ordered to execute me on sight the moment I stepped onto the executive floor. Megan had carefully laid the legal groundwork during her national television broadcast that morning. She had successfully convinced the entire world that I was a violent and highly delusional mental patient who had already brutally attacked my own son. If this mercenary shot me dead in the hallway, he would be completely legally protected. He would simply claim it was absolute self-defense against a deranged fugitive. He pulled the heavy hammer of the pistol back with his thumb. I watched his index finger slowly begin to tighten around the curved metal trigger. I did not raise my hands in surrender, and I did not take a single step backward away from the cold barrel pointed directly at my chest. My body was bleeding, smelling of toxic garbage and aching with absolute exhaustion, but I stood perfectly straight with all the authority of a man who had built this empire with his bare hands. The massive mercenary took a half step back, completely surprised by my reaction. He expected me to fall to my knees begging for mercy or try to run away like the cowards he was used to hunting. But I looked straight into his dead eyes and recognized something familiar hidden deep beneath that cold, tactical mask. I did not call him by his corporate title or the fake name Megan had put in his employment file. I called him by his real name using a deep and commanding voice that echoed down the quiet marble hallway. "Marcus Jackson," I said slowly and clearly. The gun in his hand trembled slightly when he heard the name he had tried to bury decades ago under the identity of a ruthless contractor. He gritted his teeth and ordered me to shut my mouth immediately, but I did not stop talking. I reminded him that 30 years ago he was not a highly paid mercenary working for corrupt billionaires. He was a terrified young private serving directly under my command in a Marine platoon deployed to a bloody and remote combat zone. I reminded him of that terrible night when our unit was ambushed in a dark ravine and he caught a bullet that tore right through his right thigh. The other men in the squad wanted to leave him behind because they thought he would not survive the night and carrying a wounded man would severely slow down our retreat. But I refused a direct order from my superiors and personally carried him on my back through 3 miles of exploding jungle to reach the medical evacuation point. I saved his life and gave him the chance to go home and see his daughter born. He owed me his life, and we both knew it perfectly well. Even though a massive amount of time had passed and the physical scars had faded, that blood debt had never truly been erased. Marcus blinked rapidly, and his breathing became heavy as those bloody memories flooded his mind. He told me he was grateful for what I did in the past, but right now he was a professional contractor holding a massive contract from my daughter-in-law. He tried to justify his actions by claiming he had to follow orders and protect the assets for the new owners of this empire. I let out a bitter laugh at the phrase "new owners." I reached into my soaked coat pocket very slowly so he would not think I was drawing a weapon. I pulled out the cheap laptop and opened it right in front of the gun barrel. I pulled up the data from the decrypted hard drive and turned the glowing screen toward him. I told him to read the corporate restructuring plan Richard Thorne had secretly attached to the land sale contract. The color completely drained from his face as his eyes scanned the cold text. The document clearly stated that the second the ink dried at 2:00 this afternoon, the entire current security team would be immediately terminated without any severance pay. Richard never trusted outside mercenaries, and he planned to replace Marcus and his men with the internal security force of the rival corporation today. They did not view Marcus as a loyal partner. They viewed him and his brothers as disposable guard dogs who would be thrown out into the street the moment the deal was finalized. I looked him in the eye and told him he was about to execute his former commander to protect cowards who were stabbing him in the back. I asked him where his Marine honor had gone if he was willing to sell his soul to a family of greedy thieves who planned to throw him away tomorrow. Marcus stood completely frozen for what felt like an eternity. His eyes were glued to the computer screen, and the cold words proving the ruthless betrayal of the very people he was protecting with his life. His jaw clenched tight with massive suppressed anger. He slowly looked away from the glowing screen and stared deeply into my bruised face. Not a single word was spoken between two old soldiers in that heavy silence. Marcus slowly lowered the tactical pistol away from my chest and pointed it down at the cold marble floor. He holstered the heavy weapon at his side and stood up straight, assuming the respectful posture of a true Marine who had finally found his honor again. His blind loyalty bought by corrupt money had been completely broken by the crushing weight of the truth. He took a step back and gave me a slow, respectful nod. He reached up to his chest and pulled the master security keycard from his heavy tactical vest. He did not say a word as he walked right past me and headed straight for the massive closed oak doors of the corporate boardroom. Behind those heavy doors sat the traitors who were preparing to tear my legacy apart and celebrate the collapse of an empire. Marcus swiped the MasterCard over the digital scanner mounted on the wall. A soft beep echoed in the hallway, signaling that the complex security locks had been completely disabled. He grabbed the heavy brass handles and used his massive strength to push the thick oak doors wide open. I took a deep breath and stepped over the threshold with the absolute presence of a king returning to his stolen throne. I looked up at the digital clock mounted on the far wall of the boardroom. The bright red numbers displayed exactly 1:58 in the afternoon. The countdown was officially over, and the real war was finally about to begin. I stepped through the heavy wooden doorway and walked straight into the massive corporate boardroom. My heavy steel-toed boots pounded against the polished hardwood floor, creating a loud rhythmic echo that instantly shattered the quiet professional atmosphere of the room. I was completely soaked in freezing rain and covered in toxic dark mud from the underground sewer system. My face was badly bruised, bleeding, and exhausted from a brutal night of running for my life, but I held my head high with absolute authority. I did not look like the polished executive they were used to seeing sitting at the head of this massive glass table. I looked like a man who had literally crawled out of a dark grave to seek his immediate vengeance. The high-end lighting fixtures mounted on the ceiling cast a bright, clinical glow over the massive room, illuminating the terrified faces of the people who thought they had completely buried me. I walked past the expensive leather chairs and the catered silver trays of hot coffee, completely ignoring the luxurious surroundings I had personally paid for decades ago. Every single step I took felt like a heavy hammer striking the final nails into their corporate coffins. I reached the very center of the long glass table and stood perfectly still facing my enemies. The digital clock mounted on the far wall silently ticked to exactly 1:59. I had exactly 60 seconds left to completely detonate their perfect crime and tear their financial empire down to its very foundations. The entire room froze in absolute shock. It was as if someone had hit a massive pause button on reality. My son Kendrick was sitting at the far end of the long table holding my solid gold fountain pen, hovering just an inch above the final signature line of the massive real estate contract. His hand began to shake violently the exact moment he saw my bruised and battered face. The expensive pen slipped from his trembling fingers and rolled aimlessly across the smooth glass surface. Megan was standing right behind him, wearing a tailored designer suit, looking like a triumphant queen about to claim her stolen kingdom. All the color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking completely pale and horrified. She stared at me as if she was looking at a terrifying ghost returning to haunt her. On the opposite side of the massive table sat 5 wealthy executives from Apex Global. They were my biggest corporate rivals, dressed in immaculate gray suits and wearing expensive luxury watches. They looked completely confused and highly alarmed by my sudden and violent intrusion. They did not understand why the man they thought was locked inside a state psychiatric hospital was currently standing in front of them, dripping toxic sludge onto the expensive boardroom carpet. Megan was the first person to finally break the heavy, paralyzing silence. She let out a piercing and desperate scream, ordering the rival executives to stay in their seats and loudly demanding that someone call the police immediately. She pointed a violently shaking finger at me, and screamed that I was a highly dangerous fugitive who had violently broken into the secure building to cause physical harm to her family. I completely ignored her frantic yelling. I did not look at her, and I did not speak to her because she was no longer in control of the narrative. I kept my eyes locked directly on the lead executive from Apex Global. I reached inside my heavy-soaked coat and pulled out the digital laptop containing the decrypted financial evidence and the high-resolution scans of the forged property documents. I slammed the heavy electronic device down onto the center of the glass table with massive physical force cracking the smooth surface and sending a loud echo through the large room. The loud physical impact silenced Megan instantly. I looked directly at the rival executives and spoke with a calm but incredibly dangerous tone that demanded absolute attention. I told them to put their pens down and step away from the contract immediately. I clearly explained that the massive Southside freight terminal did not belong to Hayes Logistics, and it never had. I told them the highly valuable land they were attempting to purchase belonged entirely to a private charitable trust established by my late wife over 2 decades ago. I pointed a steady finger at the thick contract lying in front of Kendrick and declared that every single signature on that document was a complete and absolute forgery orchestrated by Richard Thorne and his desperate daughter. I warned the wealthy executives that if they signed their names to that fraudulent contract, they would instantly become active accomplices in a massive federal real estate scam. I told them they would not just lose their massive purchase money, but they would completely destroy their own corporate reputations and face immediate federal prison sentences for aiding a massive criminal conspiracy. I challenged them to look at the microscopic physical evidence on the laptop screen, showing the damaged notary stamp that absolutely proved the property transfer was illegally backdated and entirely fake. I explained how my daughter-in-law had used a damaged stamp to backdate a document 3 years before the stamp was actually broken. I told them I was giving them exactly one chance to walk out of this room with their freedom and their wealth intact before the federal authorities arrived to clean up this massive criminal mess. I leaned heavily over the cracked glass table, ensuring my eyes locked with every single one of the buyers. I told them Richard Thorne was drowning in toxic debt and using this fake sale to save himself, leaving them holding a completely worthless piece of paper. The lead executive from Apex Global immediately stood up from his heavy leather chair and aggressively pushed the fraudulent contract away from him as if it was on fire. He looked at Megan with absolute disgust and pure fury burning in his eyes. Corporate executives were ruthless predators, but they were incredibly careful to never involve themselves in easily provable federal crimes involving forged signatures and charitable trusts. He loudly demanded that his legal team immediately cancel the massive wire transfer that was scheduled to be released exactly at 2 o'clock. The other rival executives quickly gathered their expensive leather briefcases and stood up looking completely panicked by the massive legal liability. They shouted at Megan, calling her a complete liability and a foolish criminal. They loudly declared that the massive deal was completely dead and that they would be immediately contacting the federal authorities to protect themselves from this toxic and highly illegal transaction. Megan realized her entire world was violently collapsing right in front of her eyes in a matter of seconds. She practically lunged across the glass table, desperately waving her arms to stop the rival executives from leaving the room. She reached frantically into her leather briefcase and violently pulled out the heavy folder containing the fraudulent medical power of attorney she had used to steal my life. She screamed at the top of her lungs that I was a completely delusional old man suffering from severe terminal dementia and violent paranoia. She told the executives to completely ignore everything I said because I was legally incompetent and highly dangerous to society. She claimed the documents I presented were insane fabrications created by a sick mind completely detached from reality. But before the executives could even respond, the heavy wooden doors of the boardroom were violently kicked open from the outside. A massive tactical team of local police officers stormed into the room with their heavy weapons drawn and pointed directly at my chest. Megan had successfully triggered the silent emergency alarm mounted under the table during my speech. The police officers aggressively shoved me against the cold glass wall, forcing my bruised face against the hard surface. They pulled my arms violently behind my back, and I felt the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs lock tightly around my wrists. The police officers shoved me hard against the cold glass wall of the boardroom. Their rough hands twisted my arms behind my back with absolute cruelty, and the freezing steel of the handcuffs tightened around my wrists until they bled. A sharp pain shot from my shoulders straight to my brain, but I did not let out a single groan. One officer pushed my head down hard against the cracked glass table while another quickly searched the soaked pockets of my heavy coat for weapons. Megan stood a few feet away with her eyes wide open in pure triumph as she watched the scene she had carefully orchestrated. She truly believed the legal system was completely on her side, and the old man standing in her way was finally removed forever. The rival corporate executives stood back against the wall with pale faces, terrified by the chaos. My son Kendrick remained seated with his head bowed, completely unable to look up at his father being treated like a dangerous criminal. The atmosphere in the boardroom became incredibly suffocating and tense as the police radios crackled with static, confirming the target was successfully secured. I slowly lifted my head from the glass table and kept my face as cold as ice. I did not resist the grip of the police officers, and I did not try to explain anything to them. My eyes locked directly onto the smirking face of Megan. My gaze did not contain any panic or despair. It was the absolute stare of a predator patiently watching its prey walk directly into the final trap. Megan tried to maintain the look of an innocent victim, but her pale smile began to tremble when she realized the terrifying calmness in my eyes. She did not understand how a man who just lost his entire company and faced a life sentence in a psychiatric hospital could remain so incredibly composed. She swallowed hard and took a half step back to escape my sharp stare. She had absolutely no idea that all her efforts were just the final struggles before the real verdict was announced. Just as the police officer prepared to drag me out of the boardroom, the heavy oak doors were pushed wide open once again. My ruthless lawyer, Nathaniel Reed, walked into the room with incredibly confident and authoritative strides. Walking right behind him were two men in crisp black suits carrying the official badges of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nathaniel did not even glance at the local police officers holding me down. He walked straight to the head of the boardroom table and slammed a thick legal file bearing a government seal right in front of Megan. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted from chaotic to absolute dead silence. Nathaniel coldly announced that the medical arrest warrant against me had been completely suspended by an emergency order from a federal judge. Megan stammered, trying to object, but the two federal agents stepped forward and ordered her to remain completely silent. Nathaniel pulled a detailed forensic report signed by top experts from the thick folder. He read every single word out loud, confirming that the notary stamp on the land transfer contract was a complete forgery made from a physical stamp that was damaged exactly 1 year ago. This completely contradicted the date, which was backdated 3 full years on the contract Megan submitted. The rival buyers gasped in pure shock as the ironclad evidence was exposed right in front of their eyes. But Nathaniel was not done yet. He pulled out a digital tablet and played a crystal-clear video extracted from the hidden security camera in my old office. The footage clearly displayed the time as exactly 6 in the evening from 2 days ago. The video played the audio of Megan laughing at me while she confidently forged my signature onto the fake medical documents. The scene was so sharp and undeniably real that no lawyer or judge in the world could ever dispute it. Every single cruel word and illegal action she took was exposed completely naked before the police and the business partners. Nathaniel put the tablet away and looked directly into the pale white face of Megan. He announced that she was officially under active investigation for massive federal financial fraud, forging critical legal documents, and conspiring to illegally strip a citizen of his civil rights. The order to freeze all bank accounts belonging to her and her father, Richard Thorne, had been triggered across the entire global system 15 minutes ago. Every single escape route for Megan was completely sealed off. The massive wall of lies she had carefully built crumbled into tiny pieces in less than 3 minutes. The local police officers holding my arms immediately loosened their grip and stepped back when they realized they were almost used as tools for a massive corporate crime. Her guilt was now as clear as the bright day, and there was absolutely no legal loophole left to save her. The executives from Apex Global quickly backed away from her as if she carried a deadly infectious disease. Her perfect plan to steal my wealth and throw me into a madhouse had completely transformed into a long federal prison sentence hanging right over her head. In a state of absolute panic and facing the terrifying reality of losing all her freedom, Megan finally revealed her true cowardly nature. She gasped for air and her eyes darted wildly around the room, looking for one final way out. Suddenly, she spun around and pointed a violently shaking finger directly at the face of Kendrick. Her voice was piercing and filled with pure desperation as she screamed that her husband was the actual mastermind behind this entire disgusting plot. She cried and fabricated a massive lie claiming Kendrick had violently forced her to do everything to pay off massive gambling debts he had hidden for years. She swore to the federal agents that she was just a poor, helpless wife manipulated and threatened with physical violence. Her lying accusation was as sharp as a knife stabbing straight into the heart of Kendrick. The weak man lifted his head with wide eyes filled with absolute shock and pure agony. He finally realized that the woman he had sold his own father out to protect was now ruthlessly throwing him to the wolves just to save her own skin. Kendrick stood completely frozen like a soulless stone statue when he heard the vicious accusations coming directly from the mouth of the wife he had always worshipped. His eyes were wide open, containing absolute shock and total horror. He could not believe his own ears anymore. He had abandoned his own biological father and betrayed his bloodline and his entire family legacy just to please the woman standing right in front of him. He had closed his eyes and ignored everything when she planned to steal the assets and throw his father into a mental asylum. And now, when everything collapsed, she did not hesitate to throw him straight into the fire to save herself. Kendrick turned completely pale without a single drop of blood left in his face. He opened his mouth to say something to defend himself, but his throat was completely choked and unable to make a single sound. The harsh truth came crashing down on his head like a brutal hammer, destroying all his illusions about love and marriage. Megan did not look at him with any sympathy. She just glared at the federal agents continuing to weave a perfect narrative where she was the victim and he was an abusive monster. Kendrick finally realized he was nothing more than a cheap puppet and a scapegoat in the calculating chess game of the Thorne family. I stood with my arms crossed watching that pathetic scene, and memories from the past suddenly flashed through my mind like a fast-forward movie. I remembered the days working extremely hard at the docks in the freezing rain just to buy Kendrick the most expensive toy in the store. I remembered all the times I used my money and power to clean up the massive messes he caused, from drunk driving incidents in college to massive debts from his reckless spending. I had blindly protected and spoiled him because I did not want my son to suffer the poverty and injustice I had experienced. But that exact overprotection had completely stripped him of the chance to become a real man. It created a weak and cowardly person willing to sell his soul purely out of greed. The last feeling of love in my heart for this son slowly grew cold and completely vanished. It was replaced by a deep disgust rising in my throat. I was looking at a pathetic parasite with absolutely no honor or self-respect, instead of the heir I had spent my entire life building. The last bit of strength in his legs completely disappeared, causing Kendrick to collapse onto the thick carpet of the corporate boardroom. He crawled desperately toward me and wrapped both his arms tightly around my legs, exactly like a child crying for mercy. Tears streamed down his pathetic face, mixing with cold sweat. He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes and began crying and begging me to save him from the federal prison sentence hanging over his head. He shook his head repeatedly and blamed his wife and her family, swearing he never wanted to do these disgusting things. He sobbed and claimed Richard Thorne used massive gambling debts to blackmail him, and Megan used psychological manipulation to brainwash him into believing I was actually losing my mind. "Dad, please, you have to believe me," he screamed desperately, begging me to tell the federal agents it was all a massive misunderstanding. He begged me to hire the best legal team to prove he was just a deceived victim. I stood perfectly still like a solid stone wall, looking down at the man crying at my feet. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I slowly but firmly pulled my leg out of his desperate embrace, causing him to fall forward. I looked straight into his eyes and delivered the most brutal judgment a father could ever give his son. I told him a real man stands up and takes absolute responsibility for his decisions instead of blaming others when backed into a corner. He was a grown adult and had the absolute right to choose, but he chose betrayal. He chose to watch me get stripped of my freedom and honor just to keep his flashy lifestyle. I emphasized every single word, telling him I handed him a massive kingdom, and he chose to sell it to a bunch of thieves. "Call a public defender," I said with a tone so incredibly cold it could freeze the entire room, because I will not spend a single penny to pay legal fees for an enemy. My declaration was a harsh and absolute end to his final ray of hope. Kendrick buried his face in the floor and cried heavily, but his sobbing only echoed in the absolute contempt of everyone present in the room. The two federal agents did not waste another second on the pathetic drama of this family. They stepped forward and roughly pulled Kendrick up from the cold marble floor. The heavy steel handcuffs locked tightly around the wrists of both him and Megan, making dry and cold clicking sounds, signaling the permanent end to their freedom. Megan continued to scream and curse at Kendrick while he just kept his head down and walked with heavy steps. The local police and the agents quickly escorted the two traitors out of the boardroom, dragging them down the long hallway toward the elevators. The image of the two arrogant people who wanted to steal everything from me now looked incredibly pathetic and humiliating as they were led away in front of dozens of curious and judgmental employees standing in the hall. When the massive oak doors finally closed behind the police officers, everything in the corporate boardroom instantly fell into a terrifyingly absolute silence. The rival executives had already quietly slipped away earlier, not daring to leave a single trace connecting them to this massive legal scandal. The massive room now held only me and my lawyer, Nathaniel Reed. The suffocating atmosphere slowly faded away, making room for the cold and quiet peace of a brutal victory. I walked over to the cracked glass table and looked down at the messy, scattered papers and my solid gold fountain pen. My eyes stopped on the expensive, leather-wrapped smartphone Megan had left behind in her absolute panic. The screen suddenly lit up, showing a new incoming message. I slowly picked up the device and swiped the screen to unlock it using a simple number code I had already guessed. I opened the contacts, looking for the single name, waiting for the results of this meeting. I pressed my dirt-covered thumb on the live video call icon to connect with the ultimate mastermind of this entire conspiracy. The screen showed it was ringing Richard Thorne. The phone rang exactly 3 times before the video connection was finally established across the secure network. The screen cleared to reveal the extremely confident face of Richard Thorne sitting in his luxurious penthouse office. He was leaning back heavily in his expensive leather chair, holding a crystal glass of aged scotch and smoking a thick imported cigar. A massive, self-satisfied smile stretched across his wealthy face. He fully expected to see the face of his daughter Megan calling to confirm that the massive real estate contract had been officially signed and the millions of dollars had successfully cleared into his offshore accounts. He expected to hear that the logistics empire I spent my entire life building was finally his personal property and that his crushing corporate debts were completely wiped out forever. Richard took a long, slow drag from his cigar and blew a thick cloud of gray smoke toward the camera lens. "Well, it is exactly 2:00, my dear," he said with a deep, arrogant chuckle, clearly enjoying the moment of his ultimate victory. "Tell me the ink is completely dry and we are officially the new kings of the logistics industry." I held the phone perfectly still and let him enjoy his pathetic fantasy for exactly 3 more seconds. The massive smile on his face instantly vanished the very second the smoke cleared, and he realized he was absolutely not looking at his daughter. He was looking directly into the bruised and battered face of the man he thought he had completely buried. His heavy glass of scotch slipped from his hand and shattered loudly on his pristine mahogany desk, spilling amber liquid everywhere. I did not smile back at him, and I did not raise my voice in anger. I spoke with the deep and absolute authority of a man who held the power of life and death over his entire empire. "Hello, Richard," I said slowly, letting the cold reality of my voice completely shatter his arrogant world. "I am afraid your daughter is currently unavailable to take your important call today. She is a bit tied up at the moment dealing with the federal agents who just put her in heavy steel handcuffs." Richard stared at the small screen in absolute horror, his mouth hanging open like a dying fish. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic stammer came out of his throat. He could not comprehend how the crazy old man who was supposed to be heavily sedated in a state psychiatric hospital was currently standing inside the executive boardroom holding his daughter's personal cell phone. The absolute shock on his face was incredibly satisfying to watch. "You made a very fatal miscalculation, Richard," I continued calmly. "You thought you could walk into my house, steal my legacy, and throw me away like trash. But you forgot that I built my kingdom in the dirt while you inherited yours. I know exactly how to fight in the dark." Richard slammed his fist violently against his wet mahogany desk. His face turned bright red with pure aggressive rage. "You are a dead man, Harrison," he screamed into the microphone, his voice completely losing its polished billionaire tone. "I do not know how you escaped that hospital, but my security teams will find you and they will put you in the ground permanently. You have absolutely nothing left. I own your bank accounts and I own your company." I shook my head slowly and completely destroyed his final illusion. "You own absolutely nothing, Richard." I corrected him coldly. I broke into your personal wall safe last night and I took your physical leather ledger. I also paid a visit to your highly encrypted corporate servers. I told him exactly what I had done with the digital copies of his ruined empire. Right now, a highly skilled digital hacker named Dexter is handing over the completely decrypted contents of your shadow ledger directly to the Cybercrimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every single illegal wire transfer, every single offshore shell company, and every single bribe you ever paid over the last 10 years is currently being printed out on federal evidence paper. Richard stopped breathing entirely. The color drained from his angry face, leaving him looking like a sick old man. He knew exactly what was inside that ledger, and he knew it meant a lifetime in federal prison. Furthermore, I added, my tone dropping even colder. The federal authorities have already confirmed the massive forgery your daughter committed today. They know she used a broken notary stamp to fake the property transfer of the Southside Freight Terminal. Because of that massive federal crime, the government has officially triggered a global freeze on every single financial asset connected to your name. Your domestic accounts are completely locked. Your Cayman Island trusts are seized. You cannot move a single penny anywhere in the world. You are completely and absolutely bankrupt. Richard lost his mind completely. He started screaming violent and unhinged threats into the camera. He swore he would hire the most expensive assassins in the world to hunt me down. He threatened to burn my logistics company to the ground and murder everyone I ever cared about. He sounded exactly like the desperate and pathetic criminal he truly was. He was a cornered rat lashing out blindly because he knew there was absolutely no escape from the trap closing around him. I let him scream and curse until his voice went completely hoarse. I did not feel a single ounce of fear listening to his violent threats. His words were completely empty now because he had no money left to pay his private armies. He was just a broken old man yelling at a piece of glass. "Your threats are completely useless, Richard," I said, cutting through his pathetic screaming. "You should save your breath for the federal judge." Richard continued to shout obscenities, but I stopped listening to him completely. I turned my back to the cracked glass table of the boardroom and walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city skyline. The heavy freezing rain had finally stopped, leaving the city washed clean under a gray afternoon sky. From my high vantage point on the executive floor, I had a perfect and unobstructed view of the entire downtown financial district, including the massive glass skyscraper that served as the global headquarters for the Thorne corporate empire. It was located exactly 3 blocks away from my building. I held the smartphone steady in my hand and slowly rotated the camera lens away from my face. I pointed the high-definition camera directly through the thick boardroom window, aiming it straight down at the massive concrete plaza surrounding his building. I made sure Richard had a perfectly clear view of his own front door on the video feed. A massive convoy of heavily armored black tactical vehicles and dozens of flashing police cruisers were rapidly swarming into the private parking lot of the Thorne corporate plaza. I could clearly see the tactical teams from the Federal Economic Crimes Division pouring out of the heavy trucks wearing dark bulletproof vests and carrying heavy assault rifles. They were violently smashing through the front glass doors of his pristine lobby, securing the perimeter and completely locking down his entire building. Richard stopped screaming instantly. Only the sound of his heavy, terrified breathing came through the small phone speaker. He was watching his entire life and his massive empire being physically dismantled by the federal government in real time. The tactical teams were already storming up the stairwells, heading directly for his penthouse office. "They will be coming through your door in exactly 60 seconds, Richard," I said softly into the microphone. "You wanted to steal my home, so I made absolutely sure you lost yours. Enjoy the rest of your pathetic life behind heavy steel bars." I did not wait for him to respond. I did not want to hear his final pathetic apologies or his desperate begging. I pressed my thumb firmly against the red button on the screen and disconnected the live video call. I dropped the expensive smartphone onto the cold marble floor and crushed it completely into tiny pieces under the heavy heel of my steel-toed boot. The war was officially over. 1 month had passed since that freezing and brutal rainy day. The atmosphere in the top-floor office of the Hayes Logistics Tower was now completely quiet and clear under the bright morning winter sun. I stood silently in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling glass window looking down at the busy streets of the financial district. The heavy trucks carrying my company logo were moving smoothly like a continuous and healthy bloodstream through the veins of the city. I turned around and walked slowly toward the solid mahogany desk. I placed my scarred hands on the soft leather backrest of the chairman chair. This was not just an expensive piece of corporate furniture. It was the ultimate symbol of my 40 years of sweat, blood, and massive sacrifice. I slowly sat down in the familiar chair and felt the heavy weight of absolute power and responsibility returning to my shoulders. This feeling was completely different from a month ago. I was no longer a tired old man wanting to escape work and hand my kingdom over to a weak and cowardly generation. The recent life and death battle had completely burned away all my weakness and reforged the iron will of a ruthless Marine. I had successfully taken my throne back from the traitors, and I was never going to let it go again. On the smooth, polished desk right in front of me was a thin but incredibly powerful legal file. It was the official ruling from the federal court. The medical commitment order and the forged power of attorney Megan had used to try to lock me inside a mental asylum had been completely canceled and erased from the system. The corrupt specialist doctor who took heavy bribes to falsely diagnose my terminal dementia was now facing a massive prison sentence and had been permanently stripped of his medical license. The national media reports had also been completely corrected. The television stations that once broadcast my fugitive photo were now continuously reporting on my absolute innocence and exposing the massive financial crime network built by Richard Thorne. My name had been completely washed clean of all the lying stains. My civil rights, my legal right to control my own assets, and my absolute authority over every single business operation of Hayes Logistics had been fully restored to my hands. At exactly 10 in the morning, I walked into the massive auditorium located on the ground floor of the main headquarters building. Every single employee of the company, from the senior executives to the truck drivers and warehouse workers, was present in the room. The massive space was so quiet you could actually hear the breathing of the people sitting in the front row. I stepped up to the wooden podium and looked out at the hundreds of faces looking back at me with absolute respect and anticipation. There were people who had worked closely with me since the incredibly difficult early days, and young people who had just recently joined the corporation. I did not use the fancy and empty words of wealthy capitalists to open this important meeting. I bowed deeply to all my employees, giving them a deep bow of genuine regret and absolute responsibility. I told them I was incredibly sorry for my past blindness and foolish arrogance. I admitted that I had entrusted the life of this massive company to unworthy people simply out of blind family loyalty, and had almost destroyed the thousands of livelihoods of the loyal people sitting right in front of me. I announced with a booming voice that the era of weakness and blind tolerance was officially over forever in this place. Starting today, this logistics empire would be protected and managed by the people who had truly proven their loyalty in the darkest and most dangerous times. I called Dexter to the stage. The young man I had fired 10 years ago now stepped up with a completely new and highly confident demeanor. I officially appointed Dexter as the global cybersecurity director of the entire corporation. He would receive an absolutely unlimited budget to build an impenetrable digital firewall to protect all our cash flow and classified corporate data from any future attack. Then I called Hector forward. The old janitor with calloused hands stepped up to the podium wearing his familiar worker uniform. I turned to the entire staff and said this brave man used a heavy garbage truck to face gun barrels and save my life from trained killers. I pulled out a legal contract and signed it right on the spot, giving Hector a massive amount of reward shares in the company. He was no longer just a cleaning staff member, but now an official shareholder with real voting power on the board of directors of this empire. The decision to highly value brave people from the absolute bottom of society created a massive earthquake of positive energy throughout the entire company. The dark doubt and panic previously spread by Megan instantly vanished without a single trace. Thousands of employees stood up and applauded loudly, and their faith in the future of Hayes Logistics was brightly lit once again. My logistics empire began its massive rebuilding process at an incredible speed. The vital partnership contracts that were previously threatened with cancellation were now officially re-signed with much more favorable financial terms. Clean and legitimate cash flowed strongly back into our official corporate accounts. Protected by the advanced cybersecurity network established by Dexter and the absolute loyalty of solid allies like Hector, the company rapidly became an impenetrable economic fortress that no rival could ever touch. Late one afternoon, while I was quietly reviewing the new financial reports, the heavy office door opened. My ruthless lawyer, Nathaniel Reed, walked in with a highly serious expression, carrying a thick brown envelope stamped by the federal prison system. He sat down in the leather chair across from me and announced that the official sentencing hearing for Kendrick and Megan would take place at exactly 9 in the morning tomorrow. Megan was facing a brutal 20 years in federal prison for massive financial fraud and the forgery of critical legal documents. Kendrick could not escape severe punishment either, with an expected sentence of 10 years in a maximum security federal prison, acting as a willing accomplice to the massive crime. Nathaniel placed the stamped brown envelope on the desk and said Kendrick had just sent an urgent request through his state-appointed public defender. My son wanted to beg for one final private meeting with me in the cold visitation room of the federal prison tonight, right before the official sentence was permanently handed down. He desperately wanted to look at my face one last time. I stared blankly at the brown envelope lying on my desk and felt a freezing cold silence completely wrap around my tired mind. I picked up the thick brown envelope from my mahogany desk and told Nathaniel I would go alone. The federal detention center was located on the cold industrial outskirts of the city, surrounded by massive concrete walls and layers of razor wire. I drove through the heavy security gates and walked into the main processing facility. I walked past the heavy metal detectors and handed my identification to the armed guards standing at the reinforced steel doors. They escorted me down a long, sterile hallway lit by harsh fluorescent lights until we reached the maximum security visitation room. The room was divided entirely by a thick wall of bulletproof glass separating the free world from the caged one. I sat down on the cold metal stool and waited patiently. A heavy steel door on the opposite side of the glass buzzed loudly and slid open. Two massive correctional officers escorted my son into the small concrete booth. He was wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit that hung extremely loosely on his shrinking frame. The heavy steel chains locked tightly around his waist and wrists rattled loudly as he slowly sat down on his metal stool. I picked up the black plastic telephone receiver mounted on the wall and pressed it to my ear. Kendrick picked up his receiver with violently trembling hands. We stared at each other through the thick, scratched glass. He looked completely destroyed. The arrogant and polished corporate executive who had tried to steal my entire empire just 1 month ago was completely gone. In his place sat a terrified and broken man who looked like he had not slept in several weeks. His face was pale and covered in a messy dark beard, and his eyes were completely hollow and sunken. He swallowed hard and his voice cracked violently through the cheap plastic speaker of the telephone. He did not ask how I was doing, and he did not ask about the company he had tried to destroy. He immediately started crying and begging for mercy. He told me the federal prosecutor was willing to reduce his sentence from 10 years down to exactly 3 years if I wrote an official letter of clemency to the federal judge tomorrow morning. He pleaded with me to tell the court that he was severely manipulated by his wife and that he was deeply remorseful for his horrible actions. He swore that he would never ask me for anything else for the rest of his life if I just signed that single piece of paper to save him from a decade behind heavy steel bars. I listened to his desperate crying and felt absolutely nothing but a cold and heavy emptiness. There was a time when seeing my son in pain would have completely broken my heart and forced me to do whatever it took to protect him. But that specific father died the night I had to fight my way out of my own house to survive his brutal betrayal. I looked directly into his red and swollen eyes and kept my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. I told him that I was absolutely not going to write a letter of clemency to the federal judge. I was not going to sign my name to a massive lie just to save him from the natural consequences of his own calculated actions. His crying stopped instantly and his jaw dropped in absolute disbelief. He pressed his chained hands against the thick bulletproof glass and asked me how I could be so incredibly cruel to my own flesh and blood. I did not blink or look away from his terrified face. I told him that true cruelty was watching your own father get diagnosed with a terminal disease and deciding to lock him in a psychiatric ward just to steal his money. True cruelty was handing your family legacy over to a massive corporate rival because you were too weak to face your own gambling debts. I explained to him that the harsh reality of the world leaves absolutely no room for cowardice and has zero tolerance for betrayal. I told him that for his entire life I had used my massive wealth and power to shield him from the fire, but that constant protection only turned him into a weak man who expected someone else to always pay for his massive mistakes. I said the 10-year federal prison sentence he was going to receive tomorrow morning was not a tragedy, but rather the absolute final lesson I could ever teach him about the true responsibilities of a man. A real man stands tall and accepts the punishment he has rightfully earned instead of begging for a shortcut out of the dark hole he dug for himself. I told him he needed to spend the next decade sitting in a concrete cell thinking about the massive difference between loyalty and greed. I said that when he finally walked out of those heavy steel doors 10 years from now, he would either be completely broken or he would finally be a real man, but I would not be there to hold his hand either way. Kendrick dropped the black plastic telephone receiver. It dangled on its short metal cord, swinging back and forth and hitting the thick glass. He buried his face in his trembling hands and began to sob uncontrollably. His shoulders shook violently as the absolute reality of his long prison sentence finally crushed his spirit. The two armed correctional officers stepped forward and grabbed him roughly by the arms, lifting him off the metal stool to escort him back to his dark cell. He did not fight them or try to look back at me one last time. I placed my receiver gently back onto the wall hook. I stood up from the cold metal stool and adjusted my heavy wool coat. I turned my back on the bulletproof glass and walked down the long, sterile hallway heading toward the exit without looking back a single time. The next morning, I drove my car to the Oak Hill Cemetery exactly at 9 o'clock while the federal judge was officially handing down the harsh prison sentences to Megan and Kendrick in the downtown courthouse. The heavy, freezing rain from last month was completely gone. The morning sky was a brilliant and clear blue, and the cold winter air felt incredibly clean in my lungs. I walked slowly up the familiar green hill and stood in front of the smooth black marble headstone belonging to my late wife Corinne. I knelt down on the soft grass and gently placed a massive bouquet of fresh white roses against the cold stone. I told her that the brutal war was finally over and our fortress was completely secure once again. The sickness that tried to conquer my mind and the massive betrayal that tried to destroy our family legacy had been completely and utterly crushed. Justice had not been handed to me by a merciful legal system, but rather enforced by an unbreakable will and a total refusal to surrender to the dark. I stood up slowly and looked out over the sprawling city skyline, taking a deep breath of the cold morning air. The screen fades to black. The ultimate lesson from this brutal corporate war is that blind family loyalty can easily become your most dangerous vulnerability. You can spend your entire life building a massive empire and protecting your children from the harsh realities of the world, but overprotection only breeds weakness and entitlement. When the dark times finally arrive, true loyalty is never guaranteed by blood, it is only proven by brave actions. A real leader must possess the cold clarity to recognize a traitor, even if that traitor shares their own last name. Justice is never simply handed to you by a broken system. You must enforce it yourself with an absolutely unbreakable will and a complete refusal to become a helpless victim. Please leave a comment below to share your thoughts on this unforgiving story and subscribe to the channel for more dark and realistic tales of survival and revenge.